She had sewn $287 into the lining of her riding coat, packed a locked iron box she hadn't let out of her arm since April, and memorized the name on her new train ticket the way a person memorizes a prayer with desperation and very little faith. She was not fleeing grief. She had never been given enough of the marriage to grieve it properly. She was running from what she knew, and from the man who could not afford for her to keep knowing it. Judge Harlan Cassidy of the Kansas Circuit Court had the law, the money, the county sheriff, the territory newspaper, and 3 armed investigators who had already torn through her sister's house in Abilene while Maren watched from the street with her valise in one hand and her heart hammering, and exactly one westbound train standing between her and whatever came next. What came next was a letter from a stranger, 6 pages, badly spelled in places, honest in every single one. A rancher in the New Mexico territory named Waylon Hatch needed a wife not for romance, he wrote plainly, but for sense, for steadiness, for someone to help raise his daughter, read contracts, and not pretend the frontier was something out of a dime novel. He had 40 acres on the Cimarron Ridge, a water dispute, and a child who needed a mother. He did not promise love, he promised honesty. She had boarded the westbound train the next morning without writing back to confirm. What the letter had not told her was that Waylon Hatch already had a woman living in his house. And what she had not told him was that the iron box strapped beneath her seat contained evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful judges in the territory, and that the man it could destroy was already hunting her. The train from Dodge City arrived at Redstone, New Mexico territory on a Wednesday morning in October of 1879, 40 minutes late, and smelling of coal smoke and borrowed time. Maren Holt born. Maren Becker, daughter of a German surveyor from Topeka, widow of one of Abilene's most admired land attorneys, stepped down onto the platform with a leather valise in one hand and the iron box pressed against her ribs with the other arm. She stood in the October heat and looked out at a country that did not know her name, did not know her history, and did not in its vast and indifferent redness particularly care about either. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 6 months. Redstone was not a large town. It sat at the foot of the Cimarron Ridge, like something that had rolled down the slope and simply stopped one main street of hard-packed earth, a general store with a sunburned awning, a livery, a church whose steeple leaned 5 degrees south, a saloon with no signage whatsoever. Beyond the buildings, the land went on in every direction, red rock and sage, and the enormous blue weight of the October sky pressing down on all of it. A boy of about 12 was asleep against a water barrel outside the station, his hat pulled over his face. "You know a man named Waylon Hatch?" she asked him. He blinked awake, pushed back his hat, and looked at her with the frank, unself-conscious evaluation that only very young people and very old people would still permit themselves. "Everybody knows Mr. Hatch," he said. "Can you tell me how to reach his property?" "About 4 miles north, up toward the ridge." He squinted at the iron box under her arm. "You the woman he sent for the bride?" The heat came into her face. She had not considered how quickly a small town would have assembled this particular fact from the available evidence, and she had underestimated the speed of it by several days. "I'm Maren Holt," she said, as though that answered everything. It seemed to satisfy him. He pointed her toward the livery. She walked with her back straight and her eyes forward, and she did not look around in the way of a woman afraid of being watched. She had been that woman for the last year of her marriage, moving through the rooms of a fine house in Abilene, with her eyes down, making herself small and quiet and unnoticed. She had survived it. She was done with it. The liveryman Foley was a broad man of about 60 with a face the color of old saddle leather and the careful manner of someone who notices everything and mentions nothing. He quoted her a fair price for the wagon ride north, asked no questions, and had her moving within 15 minutes. She sat beside him on the bench and watched the town fall away, and she thought about the last 6 months, what they had cost her and what they had taught her, and whether the sum of those 2 amounts would ever come out even. The land changed as they moved north. The flat shelf of the town gave way to rising country juniper, on the slopes red rock outcroppings, pale dry creek beds threading between rises. The sky was something she had not been prepared for. She had grown up in Topeka and lived in Abilene, and she had thought she understood sky. She understood now that she had only ever seen sky through gaps above roof lines between buildings framed by windows. This sky was different in kind, not merely degree. It went on in every direction, enormous and patient and ancient, and below it the earth was rust and ochre and 100 shades of red. She had no names for yet, and the whole vast arrangement had the quality of something that existed before anyone alive and would exist after all of them. And in that geological patience, her own urgencies felt for a moment very small. She did not find this comforting. She found it clarifying. They came over a low rise, and she saw the Hatch property spread below a main house of adobe and rough timber, a barn with a new roof, two outbuildings, a windmill turning slowly in the afternoon breeze, a corral with a half-dozen horses moving in the late light. It was not a large operation, but it was solid. Someone had worked hard to make it, and harder still to keep it, and the evidence was in the mended fencing and the orderly outbuildings, and the fact that the whole place had an air of maintained intention, the look of a man who built things because he meant them to last. Foley drew the wagon up at the gate. She thanked him, paid him, and climbed down with her bags. She was halfway across the yard when the front door opened. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not Waylon Hatch. She was perhaps 35, fair-haired and pleasant-faced, with the sort of quiet beauty that comes from health and confidence rather than delicacy. She wore an apron over a good calico dress and carried a dish towel in her hands, and she looked at Maren with an expression that was carefully assembled and only just barely short of welcoming. "Mrs. Holt," the woman said. Maren did not slow her pace because stopping would be a kind of concession she could not afford yet. "Yes, I'm looking for Mr. Hatch. He's out with the cattle." The woman's voice was even unhurried, controlled the voice of a woman who had been practicing this particular conversation for some time and had decided exactly how she intended to play it. "I'm Dora Kinsley. I help out here." A pause that lasted one beat too long. "Please come in. You've had a long journey." Maren came in. The inside of the house told her everything in the first 10 seconds. This was not the housekeeping of a man left to his own devices. The curtains were pressed, a jar of dried wildflowers sat on the windowsill. The kitchen smelled of something slow-cooked and herb, the particular smell of a woman who had made herself at home, in a home that was not hers or not yet, or that she had been steadily and deliberately converting toward her own idea of what it should be. 8 months, that was what a neighbor woman at the train station in Dodge City had told her, that Waylon Hatch had been keeping company with a widow named Dora Kinsley for about 8 months. The neighbor woman had delivered this information with the special relish of someone handing you something sharp, and Maren had nodded pleasantly and stored it in the place where she kept things that required careful consideration later. She was considering it now, sitting at Dora Kinsley's kitchen table, drinking Dora Kinsley's coffee, saying the right things at the right intervals, with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 3 years performing gracious company at her husband's dinner parties. Dora was not hostile. Maren had braced for hostility, and what she got instead was something considerably more complicated. A woman managing herself with great precision, performing a role she understood was slipping, doing it with enough dignity to be genuinely admirable, and enough strain beneath the surface to be genuinely painful. She was still sitting there with her iron box in her lap when the front door opened again. Waylon Hatch was not what the letter had prepared her for. The letter had been plain-spoken in a way that suggested a plain-spoken man, and she had assembled a rough picture from the facts: 39-years-old rancher widower, one daughter veteran of the Apache campaign. She had expected weathered and competent and probably cold. He was all of those things. He was also, she realized with a small and entirely unwelcome internal recognition, someone whose face showed the particular damage of long loneliness. Not weakness, not self-pity, but the specific compression of a man who had stopped expecting much from people and had built his entire interior life around things that couldn't disappoint him. Land work, weather, the daily demands of animals and seasons. He was tall and lean in the way of men who labor, rather than exercise, with dark hair, gone silver at the temples, and hands that were calloused and very still at his sides. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at her. The first emotion she could clearly read on his face was not welcome. It was guilt. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "Mr. Hatch." She stood because she was not going to have this conversation sitting down. "Thank you for having me." Something flickered in his expression. He took off his hat and held it, and he looked at her the way people very rarely did, with genuine attention, taking her actual measure rather than the measure of their assumptions about her. "How was the journey?" he said. "Long," she said, "but I'm here now." Dora set a third cup on the table and excused herself with smooth efficiency, disappearing toward the back of the house. She's done this before, Maren thought. She knows exactly when to remove herself. 8 months of learning the precise moment to disappear. Waylon sat down across from her and put his hat on the table between them. Neither of them reached for the coffee. "I owe you a straight conversation," he said. "Not a question, not an apology, a statement of what was owed." "I believe you do," she agreed. He assembled his words with the careful deliberateness of a man who has spent years thinking in practical terms and is now being asked to think in the language of things that have no clean edges. "Dora Kinsley has been a considerable help to me since her husband passed," he said. "She's become accustomed to things here, the way the household runs." "And to you," Maren said. He met her eyes and did not look away. "Yes." "And the town has formed impressions." "Yes." She picked up her coffee and drank some. Good coffee. She had expected it to be good. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The question clearly surprised him. He was a man who was not often asked what he wanted. "I wanted a mother for my daughter," he said after a careful pause. "Someone steady, someone who'd be here." He looked at his hat. "What I put in that advertisement was the truth. What this place needs is the truth. I won't pretend I've managed the situation in a way that makes any of this simple." "Nothing worthwhile is simple," she said. "No." His eyes went briefly to the iron box in her lap and then deliberately away. "That looks heavy." "It is," she said and did not elaborate. They sat in the October light in Dora Kinsley's kitchen. She was already thinking of it that way, which was tactical as much as accurate, and took each other's full measure. "I'd like to meet your daughter," Maren said. Something eased in his expression. "Just a fraction, just enough." "She's at the schoolhouse until 4, he said. "I can take you over." "Good." She rose and picked up her bags. "I'll need a room, not the largest that's yours, whichever is available." He stood. "There's one at the end of the hall, east-facing. It's small." "Small is fine," she said. "I don't take up much space." This was not entirely true, but she said it with enough conviction that he believed it. She followed him down the hall. The room at the end was small and spare, with a narrow bed and a blue and white quilt and a window looking out over the corral. Someone she suspected Dora had put fresh sage in a jar on the sill. She didn't know whether this was a gesture of welcome or a territorial mark, and she supposed it didn't much matter which. She set the iron box on the floor beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and looked out at the horses moving in the corral and pressed one hand against her riding coat where $287 were sewn into the lining. She was not safe. She had bought herself time, but she was not safe. Outside in the kitchen, she could hear Dora moving with the quiet competence of a woman who believed this was her house. Maren understood that kind of belief from the inside. She had once believed she was safe in a fine house in Abilene because a man with clever eyes had given her roses every Sunday and then told her very precisely what she was not permitted to say or read or know in his presence. She was not going to make that mistake again. She was also not going to be crowded out of a room she'd been invited into. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and opened her door. In the kitchen, Waylon was speaking quietly to Dora near the stove. They stood close together in the unconscious way of people who have grown used to each other's proximity, not romantic exactly, but the intimate ease of shared daily life. When Maren appeared in the doorway, both of them looked up. Dora's expression went carefully neutral. Waylon's went to something she couldn't read. "I thought I'd help with supper," Maren said pleasantly. "If there's anything to do." A pause, 2 seconds too long. "I've got it well in hand," Dora said. "I'm sure you do." Maren pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table. "I'll keep you company then. I've been traveling all day and the kitchen smells wonderful." She sat there. She did not go anywhere. After a moment, Dora turned back to the stove. Maren found a bowl of green beans on the table, picked up a paring knife, and began snapping them with the precise, quiet efficiency of a woman who has done 10,000 such tasks without once being thanked. She did not look at Waylon. She didn't need to. She could feel the calibration happening in the room, 3 people rearranging themselves around a new reality, testing the new weights and distances. She had survived worse calibrations. Lily arrived at 4:15, carried home in the back of a neighbor's wagon. She appeared in the doorway with her school bag and her lunch pail and a face full of evaluation, and from the first moment Maren understood that this was the person whose opinion actually mattered in the Hatch household. The girl looked at her the way very intelligent children look at unexpected things, not with hostility, but with a thorough, honest assessment of someone who has not yet learned that frank scrutiny is considered rude. She was dark-haired like her father, with a serious face and a jaw set with an expression of pure inherited stubbornness. 9 years old and already carrying the specific gravity of a child who has known loss and organized herself around it. You're the lady from the letter, Lily said. I am, Maren said. Maren Holt, it's very good to meet you. My papa says you're from Abilene. I am. He says your father was a surveyor. He was. Lily considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. Can you ride a horse? Yes. Mrs. Kinsley can't, Lily said with the calm neutrality of a child reporting a meteorological fact. She says they're unpredictable. From across the room, Maren felt Dora elect not to respond. Horses are reasonable, Maren said, if you understand how they think. Lily looked at her for another long moment, filed something away, and went to wash her hands. Waylon was standing by the far window. When Maren glanced at him, he was watching his daughter with an expression she had not expected. Love so thorough and uncomplicated, it didn't know how to disguise itself. It sat naked on his face. He would not have shown it intentionally. He probably did not know he was showing it at all. She looked away quickly. It was too much to witness without feeling something, and feeling something was not the plan right now. Dinner was an exercise in triangulation. Dora served well and spoke pleasantly, and was clearly beloved by Lily in the way children love capable, consistent adults. Waylon said little, which appeared to be his habitual mode. Maren listened and watched and said the right things at the right moments, a skill refined over 3 years of her late husband Rowan's dinner parties, with powerful men who considered her decorative and were puzzled when she wasn't. After dinner, Waylon offered to show her the property before dark. Dora stayed to clean up. Lily declared she was coming too, in a tone that made clear this was not a negotiation. They walked out into the October evening. Maren, Waylon, Lily, and the sky had gone deep orange and red over the mesa, and the wind had stilled to almost nothing, and the desert held the heat of the day like a stored promise. The north pasture is the best land, Waylon said, pointing toward the darkening ridge. Spring water comes down from there. The problem is the Bellard Land Company has been disputing my rights to the water source for 9 years. There's a survey conflict. He paused. It's what keeps me up most nights. Do you have documentation, she asked. He glanced at her sideways. Some. Deed survey markers, the original territorial filing. Some. Less confidence now, the kind of pause that meant the paperwork was a problem. I can read survey documents, she said. My father surveyed property disputes for 20 years in Kansas. I learned the paperwork. He looked at her with a new quality of attention. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to reassessment. That's useful, he said. I have various useful things, she said mildly, and looked out at the ridgeline turning dark against the sky, and said nothing more about it. Lily had run ahead to check on the horse she favored. They stood in the fading light in a silence that was not comfortable but was honest, and there is a particular value to honesty even when it sits poorly. I'm sorry, Waylon said quietly, for the situation you were walking into. Dora, it's complicated. It's not what you might think, but it's also not nothing. I didn't manage it well. She turned to look at him. The last light was going, and in the half-dark, his face was something carved from the same red stone as the country formed by pressure over a long time, not by anything gentle. Mr. Hatch, she said, I'll tell you something true. I did not come here the way most women come to these arrangements. My reasons were more complicated than loneliness and a desire for a home. She paused. I'll tell you more when I know you better. What I want you to know tonight is that I have no intention of making your life harder. I have every intention of making it more workable. I am a practical woman, and I do not frighten easily. He was quiet for a long moment. I believe you, he said. Good. She looked toward the dark where Lily had disappeared. Now let's go get your daughter before she decides to saddle up in the dark. They walked back toward the lights of the house, and the stars came out over the mesa, enormous and indifferent and achingly beautiful. And she carried her iron box under her arm and her secrets in her chest, and she thought, I am alive. I am here. Whatever is coming, I am not waiting for it in Abilene. That night, she lay in the small, east-facing room and listened to the desert insects' wind horses shifting in the corral. She thought about Dora Kinsley sleeping somewhere in the same house, about Waylon Hatch lying awake at the far end of the hall, which was almost certainly what he was doing, about Lily in her small room sleeping with the soundness of a child who has organized herself around what she cannot change. She thought about the iron box on the floor beside her bed. She thought about Judge Harlan Cassidy in his courtroom in Dodge City, his black robe, his careful patience, his absolute certainty that no woman alone with a bomblio papers could outrun the reach of a man who owned the law in 2 territories. She reached down and touched the cold iron in the dark. Then she closed her eyes. She had $287 in a locked box and a room that faced east. That was enough to begin with. In the days that followed her arrival, Maren committed herself to learning the geography of the Hatch household, the way she had learned everything that mattered in her life by watching carefully before she acted. The house was not large. Adobe walls, small windows, a kitchen that was the genuine center of household life rather than a room for show. She had lived in a house in Abilene with 4 sitting rooms and a formal dining room that was never used, and a kitchen she had been gently discouraged from entering. This was different in every particular, and the difference suited her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Waylon had built it himself, the original structure and the additions, both with help from a Mexican carpenter named Tomas, who still came twice a year to check the roof. He had built it after his service in the Apache campaign, in the way that men who have survived catastrophe either break completely or press outward into some new territory. Waylon had pressed outward and built things. She was coming to understand that this was not incidental to his character, but fundamental. He was a man who responded to destruction by making. She found this privately easier to be near than the alternatives. The water situation was worse than she'd initially understood. On her 4th day, while Waylon was mending fence on the north boundary, she spread the survey maps and claim documents across the kitchen table and worked through them with the methodical patience she'd inherited from 20 years of watching her father pursue property disputes. What she found was there but quite a date discrepancy in the easement, filing a survey marker, appearing twice in the territorial register under slightly different coordinates, and a notation in the margin of the Bellard claim written in a different hand from the rest of the document. Not proof of fraud, not yet, but a thread. She made her notes in her own hand, refolded the maps along their original creases, and returned them exactly as she'd found them. She was not yet certain what to do with the thread, and she had learned the hard way that rushing with threads was how you pulled them into knots. The evenings were the strangest part of those first days. After supper, Lily went to her room with her schoolwork, and Dora departed. There were limits to the arrangement, and nighttime was one of them, and the house became its nighttime configuration. Waylon at the far end of the table with the ranch accounts, or a journal he closed, when she came near, and Maren with her own papers or her correspondence, or simply nothing, sitting with a cup of chamomile tea and the sound of the desert outside, and the lamp burning between them. They did not try to fill the silence. They sat in it. The silence was awkward for the first few evenings, and then it became less so. And by the end of the first week, it had settled into simply the particular texture of evenings. In this house, two people occupying the same space without pretense. She noticed how he looked at the door when the wind picked up. She noticed that he always checked the water barrel before coming inside at night. She noticed the small, low exhale he made barely audible when he was working through something difficult in his head. She did not remark on any of these things. She filed them. She noticed in turn that he was doing the same with her, that he tracked her movements through the house and adjusted his own accordingly, giving her room without ceremony, that he left the lamp burning past his usual hour on evenings when she was still up, that on the 3rd day when she came in from the corral with her skirt thoroughly muddied from a horse that had bumped her into the fence rail, he said nothing about the mud, nothing about whether she should be in the corral at all, and simply handed her a clean rag with the straightforward courtesy of a man who considers other people's business their own. That was when she started to believe this might actually be workable. The town of Redstone she studied from the distance of supply runs, absorbing information from conversations Waylon had at the feed store and the general store. She was building a map of the social geography, who owed whom, who had standing, where actual decisions were made versus where discussions were merely held. It was the same skill she had developed in Abilene, and she thought sometimes about how useful that skill was, and how strange that it had taken 3 years of an unhappy marriage to teach it to her. Rowan Holt had not been a cruel man. He had never raised his hand to her. He had provided generously in every material sense. He had been interested in her intelligence in the way certain men of his station are interested in intelligent wives, as accessories, as distinguishing features, as private sources of pride. He had introduced her at parties as my wife who reads law. He said it the way another man might say, my wife who plays the harp. What he had not wanted was a wife who applied that reading to him. She had understood this about the 2nd year of the marriage, and she had done what a woman in that position learns to do, found the narrow permitted channel, and moved within it with the economy of someone navigating a space too small to turn around in. She had told herself this was reasonable. She had told herself all marriages required accommodation. And then Rowan had given her the iron box and told her there wasn't much time, and she had understood that the accommodation had always been built on something she hadn't known about, and that the life she had arranged herself to fit had not been, after all, what she'd been told it was. She had taken the box. She had converted what she could to cash. She had sewn the money into her coat and read the advertisements in 3 different newspapers and written to Waylon Hatch in Redstone, New Mexico territory because his advertisement had been the most honest one she'd found, specific about what he needed, honest about what he couldn't offer, and notable for what he didn't claim. He didn't mention romance or devotion or the redemptive beauty of frontier life. He said a man with 40 acres and a daughter and a need for someone steady. She had thought she could be steady. The question she had not allowed herself in the urgent practicality of those weeks in Abilene was whether steady was going to be enough for her. She was beginning to suspect it wasn't. Not because the situation was insufficient, but because it was more than she'd expected, and more was not something she had been permitting herself to want. On the 8th night, she heard Waylon's door close at the far end of the hall, and the sound of it, the ordinary domestic sound of a man going to bed, was so different from the sound of Rowan's door closing, which had always carried the quality of a verdict being rendered, that she felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. She reached down and touched the iron box in the dark. Tomorrow she would send a message to Santa Fe. The letter was already written. She had been careful with every word. 3 weeks, she thought, maybe 4. She closed her eyes and breathed the desert air, and outside the stars wheeled in their patient indifference, and the windmill turned, and the horses shifted in the corral, and she slept. The first week taught her the rhythms of the Hatch Ranch, the way she had learned most things through careful observation and studied restraint. She was up before anyone else dressed by the time her east window turned pale in the kitchen before the stove was lit. Waylon came in from the earliest barn chores to find coffee made and bread started, and on the 3rd morning he sat down and looked at her with the quiet recalibration she had begun to recognize, a man adjusting to a change in weather. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I want something to do. I'm not decorative." He looked down at his coffee. "My wife was," he said. Then, as though he hadn't intended to say it, Adeline, the ranch wasn't what she expected. He stopped there. "Most things aren't what we expect," Maren said carefully. He didn't answer that, but he didn't close the door on it either, which was something. What she was actually doing in those early mornings before anyone else was awake was the ranch accounts. Waylon had shown her the ledgers on the 2nd day, not because he'd volunteered them, but because she had asked directly, and the directness had unsettled him enough that he handed them over before he'd thought through whether he wanted to. She had learned to rely on that particular effect. The ledgers were kept in a system that was technically coherent, but practically difficult, the accumulation of a man who was very good at running cattle and very uncomfortable with the paperwork of running cattle. She spent 3 mornings reorganizing them without comment, and on the 4th morning left her revised summary on the table before he came in. When he picked it up and read it, he went very still. "You found the Bellard discrepancy," he said. "There's a fence easement being claimed on the North Water access that predates your deed by nearly 5 years," she said, pouring coffee. "But the date on the easement doesn't match the territorial survey register from that year. Someone filed something they didn't have the right to file." He set the papers down and looked at her with a tension that was different from any look he'd given her before. This was closer to respect. She found to her slight surprise that it meant something to her. "Where did you learn to read territorial documents?" he said. "My husband was involved in a land matter in Abilene," she said carefully. "I learned enough to understand what I was looking at." He nodded slowly, and she could see him deciding not to press further. She was coming to understand a man who extended a fundamental courtesy that did not require anything in return. He did not push through closed doors. It was the quality she trusted most in him because it was the quality she had found rarest in men. Lily was a harder study. The girl had decided in the thorough way of intelligent children that Maren was an interesting problem. She wasn't hostile, she'd been raised too well for open hostility, but she tested consistently and observed constantly, and Maren had the feeling of being evaluated by a small and very serious committee of one. She accepted this because it was honest. The horse was the first turning point. It happened on the 5th day. Maren was at the corral fence watching the horses, doing nothing in particular except the useful business of being present, when she heard the sound from the paddock. A sharp wrong sound. Her body understood before her mind did. She was over the fence before she'd consciously decided to move. Lily had been trying to saddle the gray, not for the first time clearly, but something had startled him, and he'd shied sideways into her and knocked her down, and now he was circling in the tight, frightened way of a spooked horse, his hooves moving too close to a small body on the ground. Maren did not shout. She walked into the paddock with her hands at her sides, voice low and even, the words not mattering, only the tone. Slow, certain, unafraid. She moved to the gray's head and put her hand on his neck and walked him in a wide, calm circle until he settled. Then she looked at Lily, who was sitting up in the dust with her dress muddy and her jaw set and her eyes very bright. Are you hurt? Maren asked. No, Lily said. Stubborn as a stone. Good. Maren looked at the horse. He spooks on the right side. You came at him from the wrong angle. Lily stood and brushed herself off with great dignity. I know how to saddle a horse. I know you do, Maren said. But horses have bad days. You have to read them before you commit. A silence. Are you going to tell my father? Lily asked. Maren looked at her steadily. Lily's chin was up. She was braced for consequence, and the bracing was so familiar, that posture of someone who expects to be punished for an honest mistake, that something in Maren's chest tightened sharply. No, she said. It was an accident. You weren't hurt. I'd say the horse learned something too. Lily stared at her. Then Mrs. Kinsley would have told him. I'm not Mrs. Kinsley, Maren said. Something changed in Lily's eyes, not warmth yet, not enough for warmth, but the adjustment of a preliminary assessment, the beginning of a recalculation. They saddled the gray together. Maren stayed at his head and talked to him in Low German, which was her habit from childhood, and Lily worked with the quiet competence she'd been showing Maren all week. And when the horse stood calm and ready, Lily looked at her with something that might eventually become trust. You talk to horses in German? Lily asked. Depending on the horse, Maren said. Lily laughed. It came out surprised, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. But she didn't try to stop it either. On the 8th day, the stranger came to Redstone. Maren almost missed him. She had ridden in with Waylon for supplies, her first return to town sitting up on the wagon bench beside him in the morning cool. She'd noticed how the town tracked them, the small, signifying glances of a community processing new information. She was becoming real to them. She was becoming a fact. She was in the general store choosing thread when she saw him through the window. He was not remarkable to look at. Medium height, medium build, tan coat hat pulled to the right angle. He stood at the far end of the street examining the notice board, but he wasn't reading. His eyes moved too much for reading. They quartered the street with the practiced efficiency of a man paid to notice things. She had seen him before, not here, in Abilene. Outside Rowan's office on a Thursday afternoon in July, 3 weeks before Rowan died. She set down the thread with care and kept her face entirely still. He hadn't seen her yet. He was watching the saloon. She paid for what was in her basket, walked out, and crossed to where Waylon was loading grain onto the wagon. I need to go back, she said quietly. He looked at her. Something in her face had given something away because his went careful immediately. All right, he said. No questions, not yet. They were out of town in 10 minutes. She rode beside him in silence for the first mile, and then she said, I need to tell you something, not all of it yet, but enough. Tell me what you need to, he said. She looked straight ahead at the red road. My husband, Maren Holt, died in May. He was said to have died of heart failure. She pressed her hand against the iron box in her lap. He didn't. Waylon said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road. He did not flinch, and he did not fill the silence, and he did not reach for any of the easy responses. He simply waited, and the waiting was itself a kind of steadiness she had not expected. Rowan discovered that money had been diverted from a public land trust. Significant money, the kind that has serious consequences when it goes missing. She exhaled slowly. Before he died, he gave me certain documents. He told me to keep them and to be careful. He didn't have time to tell me everything. She paused. 3 weeks after he died, I opened the box. What was in it? Waylon asked. Correspondence, financial records, names. She looked at the mesa. The man responsible for the theft is my brother-in-law, Judge Harlan Cassidy of the Kansas Circuit Court. Waylon was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd made a serious error. And you came here, he said, finally, not accusatory, not even surprised, simply naming what was true. I needed to go somewhere Harlan wouldn't look immediately. Somewhere I had a legitimate reason to be. She kept her voice level. I was not expecting to find a household that needed anything other than a practical wife. I underestimated what I was walking into. You were running, he said. Yes, she said. Another quarter mile of silence. She watched the road and calculated what she would do if he turned the wagon back toward town if he told her to take her box and her secrets and find herself another arrangement. The man in town, Waylon said. A private investigator. I believe Harlan hired him. She paused. He may not know exactly where I am yet, but if he's in Redstone, it won't take long. Waylon brought the wagon to a stop on a low rise. Below them, the ranch was visible small and solid against the red earth. He looked at it for a long moment, then at her. How dangerous is this, he asked. She thought about Harlan Cassidy, about the way he had stood at Rowan's funeral in his black suit, composed and certain, and looked at her across the open grave with the precise expression of a man registering that she might be a problem. The way that expression had shifted just slightly, just enough when she had held his gaze and not looked away. Very, she said. He looked at the ranch again. You should have told me this before you came, he said. Yes, she agreed, I should have. But you didn't because you needed to go somewhere first and decide whether I was someone you could trust. She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the ranch below, his face showing nothing she could name, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Yes, she said. He picked up the reins. He clucked to the horses and they started moving again down toward the buildings and the corral and the windmill turning in the wind. Is there anything in that box that helps you, he said. Evidence that could be used. If it reached the right court, a federal court, outside Harlan's jurisdiction, yes. How do you get it there? Very carefully, she said. He said nothing more until they reached the barn. When he helped her down from the wagon the first time he had touched her, a brief, steadying grip on her arm, he held on one fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then he released her and took the horses' heads and led them inside without looking back. She stood in the yard and breathed. That evening, after Lily was in bed and Dora had gone home, Waylon came to the kitchen table and sat across from her. He had the iron box in front of him. She had left it in her room. She had been careful with it for 6 months. She looked at it on the table between them and understood with a cold clarity that she had left her door unlocked because she was not used to having a door that locked. I didn't open it, he said. She looked from the box to his face. He met her eyes directly, and his expression was not comfortable. It was the expression of a man confronting something about himself he didn't particularly like. I found it when I went to fix the chair in your room, he said. The leg's been loose since August. I picked the box up to move it, and I thought about opening it. He paused. I didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you told me something hard today, he said. And it seemed right to tell you something honest in return. He slid the box closer to her side of the table. This arrangement, whatever it might become, won't work if we don't tell each other the truth, whatever the truth is. She put her hand on the box. My husband, she said slowly, was the kind of man who said the right things and then told me very carefully what I was not permitted to do or say or know. He was not violent. He was never violent. He was just a door that locked from the outside. She looked at the lamp flame. I came here because I needed somewhere to breathe and somewhere Harlan couldn't find me easily. I told myself that was practical and that was enough. She met Waylon's eyes. It was practical, but I am starting to think I might also want something more than practical, and that frightens me considerably. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the desert was dark and patient. You don't have to decide anything, Waylon said. Not yet. No, she said. I know. He looked at the box. Is there anything I can do? She thought about it because he deserved a real answer. There's a federal attorney in Santa Fe, she said, a man named Alderton. He's the kind of man Harlan can't reach. If I could get a message to him officially with documentation, it would matter. I know a man who rides to Santa Fe twice monthly, Waylon said. His name is Cisco. He's trustworthy. Then that would help, she said. They sat at the kitchen table for another hour, talking carefully and honestly about practical things. The water rights, the investigator in town, what Harlan Cassidy was likely to do when he found her. Waylon listened completely the way she had almost forgotten people could listen, without preparing his response while she was still talking. When she finally stood to go to bed, she took the iron box from the table. At the doorway, she paused. Waylon, she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. She felt the small shift in the air between them. Yes, he said. Thank you for not opening it, she said. It matters. He looked at her steadily, and in the lamplight, and his face was less guarded than she had yet seen it, showing the thing beneath the management. Not a man without feeling. A man who had taught himself to keep feeling at a considerable distance for very good reasons, and who was perhaps beginning to reconsider the policy. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow needs thinking through. She went down the hall to her east-facing room and set the box beside the bed and lay down in the dark. She thought I told him almost everything, and the walls did not close in. She had never told anyone anything and had the walls stay where they were. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep. She did not sleep well that night, and she knew it was not Harlan that kept her awake. It was the box itself, not its contents. She had long since made her peace with what was in it, had sorted and organized and annotated it until it was as useful as a collection of damning correspondence could possibly be made. It was the fact of it on Waylon's kitchen table and the lamplight present between them, like a third person at a dinner neither of them had planned. The fact that she had told him as much as she had told people things before. She had told a lawyer in Topeka, transactional, calculated, here are copies, guard them, wait for my word. She had told no one else. Not in Abilene, not in the weeks of careful preparation before she left, not in the letter she had written to Waylon Hatch's advertisement, which had offered him her practical qualities and her willingness, and had not, for obvious reasons, mentioned any of the rest. She had told him because she had seen the investigator through the general store window, and the world had narrowed to the specific dimensions of an immediate problem, and telling Waylon had been part of solving it. That was what she told herself. But she also knew she had told him because in the kitchen that afternoon, watching him read the survey documents she'd reorganized, she had felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years of marriage to a man who called her exceptional, the sense of being looked at by someone who saw what was actually there and considered it worth something. Not as decoration, not as a feature that distinguished him from other men, as a person with weight and value in herself. This was dangerous. She had cataloged it and kept it at careful distance, and then told him about Harlan anyway. She turned over in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about what he'd said on the wagon road. When she'd finished explaining everything he had said, but you didn't because you needed to go somewhere first and decide whether I was someone you could trust. Not a question, a statement of understanding, so accurate it had caught her breath because she had not been able to name it herself, and here was a man she'd known for 8 days who had named it without being asked. She pressed her hand against the iron box beside the bed. In the morning, she would be practical again. She would think carefully about the message to Alderton and what the investigator was reporting to Harlan and what that meant for the timeline. She was good at morning. Morning was when the work existed and the work was manageable. It was only at night when the work was finished and the house was quiet that she could feel the shape of everything she wasn't letting herself want. She kept her hand on the box. She listened to the desert. The insects had gone quiet with the cold, and there was only the wind off the Cimarron Ridge, and the occasional movement of horses in the corral, and the sound of the windmill turning. And underneath all of it, something that was not quite silence, the particular ambient presence of a landscape that has existed for millions of years and is patient about existing for millions more. She had grown up with the flat Kansas sky and the wide shallow river and the smell of prairie grass in summer, and she had thought she knew what large meant. She understood now that she had only known wide. This country was large in a different direction, downward into time, into rock, into something that predated every person and every deed and every court ruling and every bad marriage, and in that depth her own urgencies felt, if not small, at least proportionate. She was beginning against her intentions to find this comforting. The days that followed had a quality she did not have words for, the quality of two people engaged in the slow, genuine process of knowing each other. Neither hurrying it nor holding it back, simply letting it accumulate the way sediment accumulates almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize the landscape has changed. She learned that Waylon made a specific expression when something in the accounts was wrong, a slight narrowing around the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening at one corner of his mouth, as though biting back something he preferred not to say out loud. She learned that Lily hummed to herself while she worked, never the same melody twice, always something incomplete, and that Waylon always looked toward the sound when he heard it, the way a man looks toward a fire unconsciously, because the fire is warm and the alternative is dark. She learned the small archaeology of the house itself, the way the third step from the bottom of the hall stairs groaned differently depending on the weather, the way the kitchen window faced exactly north, so that at midday the shadows fell straight down and the room was at its most shadowless and plain. The jar of coffee beans kept on the second shelf, not the first, and why? Because Lily had knocked the first shelf jar down twice, and so the beans had been relocated to the second shelf where small hands couldn't reach them, and Waylon had simply adjusted and never mentioned it, and this small accommodation made without announcement told her more about who he was than many larger things. She was thinking about the particular simplicity of a man who reorganized his coffee shelf without drama when she found him in the barn one afternoon, sitting on a hay bale with a letter in his hand and his face showing the look of someone who has received news that doesn't surprise them but lands hard regardless. "What is it?" she said. He looked up, considered in the way she was learning to recognize the brief assessment of what he was willing to show. Then he held the letter out. She took it and read. It was from the Bellard Land Company's attorney, precisely worded, professionally polite, the kind of letter that has a smile on its face and a knife behind its back. It informed Waylon Hatch that in light of the territorial court's decision regarding the Cimarron water rights, the company intended to exercise its easement claims on the North Spring access effective the 1st of January. This would require Waylon to reroute his primary irrigation to the south pasture at his own expense, a cost the letter acknowledged was significant and expressed sympathy for with the particular insincerity of a document drafted by someone who had never felt sympathy for anything they couldn't tax. "When did this come?" she said. "Today," he said. She read it again, more slowly this time, the way her father had taught her to read any document that claimed authority, looking not for what it said, but for what it assumed you wouldn't notice. "This is the document I found the discrepancy in," she said. "The date on the easement filing doesn't match the territorial register from that year." "I know," he said, "but knowing isn't proving, and the court has already ruled." "Which court?" He looked at her. "Circuit," he said. The cold clarity she'd felt looking through the general store window settled through her again, the specific cold of a thing she'd been half expecting and had hoped not to confirm. "Harlan's jurisdiction extends to New Mexico territory," she said. "As of 4 months ago," Waylon said. "The expansion was granted quietly. I didn't know about it until Turner mentioned it last week. He mentioned it sideways, not looking me in the eye, the way a man mentions something he's uncomfortable knowing." "Turner knows more than he's said," she said. "He's been backing Ballard's water claims for 2 years, Waylon said. "I always thought it was politics. The company has money. Money has influence. But if Harlan expanded his circuit jurisdiction specifically to cover this territory 4 months before the Bellard ruling came down, then it wasn't politics," she said. "It was arrangement." They looked at each other in the barn, afternoon light coming through the gaps in the planks, the horses moving quietly in their stalls. Outside, the wind had picked up off the mesa, and she could hear it moving through the eaves with the dry, restless sound she was coming to associate with the approach of a weather change. "Waylon," she said, "is the date on this ruling before or after the discrepancy date I found in the easement filing?" He frowned. "After." "Then the court ruled on a document that was already demonstrably altered," she said, "which means the ruling is based on fraud." She paused, "which is exactly the kind of thing that would interest a federal court. And it connects the water rights case directly to everything else in the box." He was quiet for a moment. He set the letter on the hay bale beside him and looked at it the way he had looked at the survey documents, the careful, methodical attention of a man who builds before he acts. "You think Harlan is involved in this," he said, "not just because of you, because of the water." "I think Harlan goes where his interests require him to go," she said. "And I think this water rights case became his interest the moment someone with enough money offered him something for it." She handed the letter back. "This is actually useful, Waylon." "It doesn't feel useful," he said. "No, but it connects things. It gives the federal attorney a second line of evidence that doesn't run only through Kansas. It means the case has a local dimension, a dimension that Redstone and the territorial courts will actually care about separately from anything involving Rowan." She paused. "And it means Harlan's reach into this territory is itself part of the pattern, which makes the pattern larger and harder to dismiss." He looked at the letter. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Finding the angle that makes things workable," he said. "Even the bad things." He said it not as criticism, but as careful observation, the honest observation of a man noting something he finds valuable and is uncertain how to say so directly. "I mean to say I find it useful to be near." He stopped as though the words had come out slightly differently than he'd shaped them and looked away. She did not make anything of it. She was learning the grammar of him, a man who sometimes approached the true statement sideways by way of the approximate one and trusted you to be paying attention. She was paying attention. She was paying very careful attention to everything. October turned toward November. The light over the Cimarron Ridge went lower and sharper, the shadows longer and deeply blue at their edges, and the air in the mornings took on that specific high desert cold that was clean and knife-edged rather than damp. She had not known there were so many kinds of cold. She rode out with Waylon most mornings now. This had not been formally agreed upon. It had accumulated the way things accumulated in this household. One morning she appeared at the barn and he saddled a horse, and the next morning she appeared at the barn and he saddled a horse, and by the third morning it was simply what happened without needing to be said. They rode the fence lines and the pastures and the ridge approaches, and he explained the land to her as they rode, not instructing her exactly more the way a man talks about something he loves in the presence of someone who is clearly paying attention. He showed her where the winter water ran from the snowmelt and where it pooled before it reached the spring that fed the north pasture. He showed her the section of fence where the posts had to be replaced every 2 years because something in the soil composition accelerated the rot, a fact he had discovered through expensive trial and error over 11 years, and now accepted as simply part of the nature of the place, the way you accept weather. He showed her the flat of good grass at the base of the north ridge, the meadow she had not yet seen, and said only that it was the best ground on the property and that he hadn't been able to use it properly because of the water dispute. 9 years, she thought. 9 years farming around a constraint that was fraudulently imposed. 9 years adjusting and compensating and working harder than he should have needed to work, and all of it because a man in a courtroom in Dodge City had needed to extend his reach and had found a willing partner in the Ballard Land Company. She filed this in the place where she kept things that required action. On the morning she didn't ride, she worked at the kitchen table with the survey maps and territorial documents. She had written to her contact in Topeka, Birch, who had been her father's colleague and was the only person in Kansas she trusted entirely, confirming the chain of custody for the original documents she had sent before leaving Abilene. She had written to Alderton a second time through Cisco, expanding the scope of what he knew about the Ballard connection and its relationship to the Cassidy jurisdiction expansion. She was building the structure of the case the way her father had taught her to read a survey from the outside edges, inward establishing the boundary before attempting the interior. The territorial documents were in better order than she'd initially realized. The discrepancy she'd found was not alone it had she was coming to see a family. 3 other filings in the Ballard case had similarly mismatched dates, suggesting not a single clerical error, but a pattern of deliberate alteration. She made careful notes in a separate ledger she kept locked in her own traveling bag, written in her father's surveying shorthand, which she had learned as a child and which no one else she had ever met could read fluently. This was not an accident. The evenings had settled into a rhythm she had not planned for and found she did not want to disturb. After supper, Lily went to her room with her schoolwork, and Dora departed for the boarding house, where she had taken a room. There were limits to the arrangement, and nighttime was one of them, and the house became its nighttime configuration. Waylon at the far end of the table with the ranch accounts or a journal he closed when she came near, and Maren with her own papers or her correspondence, or simply nothing, sitting with a cup of chamomile tea and the sound of the desert outside. They did not try to fill the silence. They sat in it. The silence was awkward for the first few evenings, and then it became less so. And by the end of the first week, it had settled into simply the particular texture of evenings. In this house, 2 people occupying the same space without pretense. On the 10th evening, Waylon pushed back from the table and said without preamble, "I want to tell you something about the water dispute, something I haven't told anyone because it makes me look foolish." She put down her pen. "All right. When the Ballard ruling came down 18 months ago, I had a lawyer. Fellow in Santa Fe, recommended by a man I trust. I paid him what he asked, and he told me the case was sound and we'd win on appeal." He paused. "We didn't. He filed the appeal, and then he wrote to tell me the appeal had been denied and that further legal action would be expensive and unlikely to succeed." He looked at his hands. "What I found out later from Turner of all people was that the lawyer never filed a proper appeal. He filed something, but it was incomplete. Missing attachments. Poorly argued." He paused. "Turner said he'd heard the lawyer had connections to the Ballard Company's legal team, that the Santa Fe representation was arranged before he ever came to me." Maren looked at him. "You paid a man who was already bought," she said. "Yes." He said it without self-pity, but without ease. "I trusted a recommendation, and I didn't check what I was trusting. That's not like me. I check everything on this ranch twice. I let the urgency of the situation make me careless." Harlan does that to people, she said. He creates urgency so you don't check. The urgency is part of the method. He looked at her. You sound like you've thought about this, he said. I've been thinking about it for 6 months, she said. He does it in courtrooms and in offices and in families. He creates a version of events that feels too urgent to question, and by the time you think to question it, the filing has been submitted, and the ruling has come down, and the paperwork says what he needed it to say. She paused. The urgency is the weapon. Everything else is just procedure. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what he did to Rowan? He said. She thought about this. Rowan was different. Rowan had the inside view. He knew what Harlan was doing because he was close enough to see it. The urgency Harlan used on Rowan was different, not legal urgency, but personal urgency. The urgency of a family secret. The urgency of knowing something dangerous and not knowing what to do about it. She looked at the table. Rowan sat on it for too long. He was trying to decide what he owed and what it would cost and whether there was a version of the situation in which he could come out with his hands clean. There wasn't. There never is. And you? She looked up at him. I had 3 weeks, she said. From the moment I opened the box to the moment I left Abilene. I did not try to find a version with clean hands. I tried to find a version that was survivable. She paused. They're not always the same thing. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight. Are they the same here? He asked. She considered the question honestly. I think they might be, she said. That's what I'm working toward. Dora Kinsley came every morning and left after supper, and the arrangement between the three of them had achieved a kind of uneasy stability. Dora was intelligent and had arrived evidently at some private reckoning with the situation that made her less combative than she might have been. The small domestic additions, she still brought a new jar for the windowsill. A variation on the supper menu felt less like territorial claims now, and more like what they actually were, the habits of a woman reorganizing herself around a new understanding. Slowly, with dignity, without making it anyone else's problem. Maren noticed this. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, carefully and without letting the noticing show. It would have been simpler if Dora were petty or obviously unsuitable. Instead, she was good, genuinely, unambiguously good. Patient with Lily, honest in her opinions when Waylon asked for them, capable of maintaining a gracious manner under circumstances that would have justified a great deal less grace. Maren found herself against her inclinations respecting this, and finding the respect complicated because respect made the situation more human, and more human meant more difficult. One afternoon in late October, while Waylon was on the north pasture and Lily was at school, Maren was in the kitchen working when Dora came in and sat down across from her without her usual brisk efficiency. She set down her basket. She looked at Maren for a moment with the careful directness of a woman who has decided to stop being oblique. I want to say something, Dora said. Maren put down her pen. All right. I am not stupid, Dora said. I know what's happening here. I knew the moment you walked across that yard. She paused. I've been telling myself for 8 months that what Waylon and I had was something, and maybe it was. But it wasn't what he needed. I knew that. I was hoping it would become what he needed if I gave it enough time. She looked at her hands. I think you should know that I am not going to fight for something that wasn't mine to claim. Maren looked at her. Dora, I'm not asking for anything, Dora said. I'm not asking you to be kind to me or grateful or any particular way. I'm just saying it plainly so it doesn't have to be said in pieces later. She met Maren's eyes. He's a good man. Lily is a good girl. This is a good place. She paused. Don't waste it. Maren held her gaze for a long moment. I don't intend to, she said. Dora picked up her basket and went back to the stove, and neither of them mentioned the conversation again, and things were not quite the same afterward, but they were in some way that resisted simple description easier. The investigator had not been visible in Redstone for 4 days, and this worried Maren more than his presence had. She did what she could do. She sent another letter to Birch and Topeka confirming that the copies were secure and that he should hold them without response until she wrote again. She sent a brief note to a woman she trusted in Dodge City, Hester, who had been a friend before friendship had seemed dangerous, asking only for information about Harlan's recent movements, framed as a social inquiry. She counted the days until Cisco's next ride to Santa Fe. She ran through the calculations again, how long it would take Alderton to review what she'd sent, how long for a federal warrant to be prepared, how long before anything resembling protection could be set in place. 3 weeks, she thought, maybe 4. She had survived worse waits. And then the second stranger came to town. She was at the general store on a Thursday morning, choosing thread and trying to look like someone who was only choosing thread when she became aware of a woman she had not seen in Redstone before. She was perhaps 42, fair-haired with a traveling coat that had been well used and the particular quality of awareness in her movements that Maren recognized from her own mirror, the specific calibrated alertness of a person who is watching for something without wanting to appear to be watching. Their eyes met once briefly across the dry goods counter. The woman's gaze was steady and measured and not accidental. Maren paid for her thread and brought him. She went back to the wagon. She told Waylon quietly that there was a woman in town she didn't recognize. All right, he said cautiously. She wasn't passing through, Maren said. She was looking for someone. You. I don't know. Maybe. She pressed her hand against the iron box in her lap. There's something I haven't told you, something about Rowan's family. He waited as he always waited, completely without impatience. Rowan had a younger brother, she said. Tate. He was declared dead in the war killed at Chickamauga, according to Harlan in the official record. But 3 weeks before Rowan died, he received a letter that he said was about Harlan. He said it changed everything he thought he knew. He said he needed time to think about what to do. She looked at the road. He didn't have time. And I've been wondering since I opened the box and saw what was in it, whether Tate actually died at Chickamauga, whether he survived and has been watching Harlan from somewhere safe, whether he is in fact the person who could corroborate everything in the box from the outside. Waylon drove in silence for a mile. And you think the woman might be connected to him, he said. I don't know. It could be coincidence. She paused. But she looked at me like she knew who I was. Not like she was deciding, like she already knew and had already decided what to do about it and was simply waiting for the right moment. What do you want to do? Nothing today, she said. I want to see if she's still here tomorrow. She was. On Friday morning, the woman was sitting on the boarding house porch when Maren rode past. She looked up when she heard the horse. This time she made no pretense. She held Maren's gaze with the calm, direct attention of someone who has made a decision and is prepared to act on it. Maren dismounted. She tied her horse to the rail. She walked up the steps. I'm Maren Holt, she said. The woman studied her for a long moment, taking her measure in the same unhurried way Waylon had looked at her on her first evening in Redstone, the serious assessment of someone deciding whether reality matches preparation. I know who you are, the woman said. My name is Vera Galt. I write for the Albuquerque Courier. A pause. I knew Tate Cassidy. Maren sat down in the chair across from her. Tell me, she said. Vera Galt told it methodically in the order it had happened without embellishment. Tate Cassidy had not died at Chickamauga. He had been badly wounded and left for dead, and he had survived, as men sometimes do, who have more stubbornness than sense, and something unfinished keeping them in the world. He had spent 18 months recovering in a farmhouse in northern Georgia, tended by a family who had no particular reason to help a wounded Union soldier, except that he was a human being and badly hurt. By the time he could travel and communicate his survival, Harlan had been declared his legal heir, and Tate's name had been removed from everything official that a living person's name appears on. He came west, Vera said, to Albuquerque 4 years ago. He had been surviving quietly for 2 years at that point, staying below the surface out of Harlan's sight. He knew by then what Harlan had done, what Harlan was still doing. He had been gathering for years, not in any formal sense, but gathering letters, financial records, the testimony of men who had dealt with Harlan and found the dealing costly. She kept her voice level and even. He contacted me because he needed someone with access to print and someone who could move through the territory without attracting the kind of attention that would get back to Harlan. We worked together for 3 years. And Rowan, Maren said. Tate found Rowan 8 months before Rowan died. He traced him through the Abilene Bar Association. He wrote carefully, not knowing whether Rowan knew what Harlan had done or was part of it. She paused. Rowan wrote back. He confirmed that he had known for some time that the trust fund administration was irregular. He had been watching it quietly without knowing what to do about it. Tate's letter showed him the full scope, a pause that contained something careful. He also confirmed that he had a wife. He said she was capable. He said if anything happened and if there were materials to be preserved, she would know what to do with them. Maren sat with this for a moment. He said that, she said. Yes, she looked at her hands. He had said she was capable. He had said it to a brother he hadn't spoken to in 15 years before coming home and pressing a box into her hands without explanation. He had said it apparently with more confidence than he had ever shown her directly. She thought about this. She thought about a man who had made her world smaller and had known that he was making it smaller and had been ashamed of it and who had, at the end, done the only thing he could think of to make it larger again. She thought about whether that was enough. She thought it was not enough. She thought it was also not nothing. And after Rowan died, she said, Tate died 14 months ago, Vera said with the careful evenness of someone who has processed a grief and still carries the shape of it. Cholera in Albuquerque, summer of 1878. There was an outbreak. She looked at the street. Before he died, he gave me everything he'd gathered, all of it. He told me that Rowan's wife had a box of materials that she had left Abilene, that if she reached out or if I found her, the two collections together would be what was needed. She looked at Maren. And then Harlan's investigator appeared in Redstone, and my source here sent me a message, and I came. Who is your source? Maren asked. Vera almost smiled. Foley at the livery. He's been watching Redstone for me for 2 years. Maren thought about the broad, silent liveryman who had asked her no questions and had her moving within 15 minutes of her arrival. She filed this new understanding of him with the calm of someone who has learned not to show surprise at how the pieces fit. What do you need from me? She asked. What's in the box? Vera said. Not to publish, not yet. I want to see whether what Tate gathered and what Rowan gathers say the same things. If the financial records match, if the names are the same, if the dates align, she paused. I have a contact at the Federal Circuit, a judge who is not in Harlan's pocket. If your evidence and Tate's together go to Alderton and Santa Fe with that judge's name attached, Alderton will move. I already have materials with Alderton, Maren said. I know, Vera said. I'm saying there'll be enough. The two sets together will be enough. She looked at Maren steadily. This is the case Tate spent 3 years building. It is the case your husband died before he could make. They both gave what they had to give. I think it's time to finish it. Maren sat on the boarding house porch in the cold October morning and thought about two dead men, Rowan Holt, who had given her a box and an apology in the same act, and Tate Cassidy, who had survived Chickamauga and come west and gathered and died of ordinary cholera with his case still open. And she thought about what it meant to be the person holding the thread that finished what they couldn't. I need to speak with someone first, she said. I need a day. Vera nodded. I'll be here. She rode back to the ranch and found Waylon mending the corral gate in the cold morning. She told him everything Vera had said standing in the cold morning with the gate between them, and he listened until she was finished before he spoke. Do you trust her? He said. I trust that she has her own reasons that align with mine, she said. That's not the same as trust, but it's a workable foundation. She paused. I want to compare what's in the bonds with what she has. If it aligns, if the same names and payments and dates appear in both sets of materials, then Tate Cassidy spent 3 years gathering from the outside what Rowan gathered from the inside. Two independent sources reaching the same conclusion. Alderton can move on that. And if it doesn't align, then I'll know the limits of Vera Galt's sources and I'll adjust accordingly, she said. But I don't think it won't align. I think Tate and Rowan were looking at the same thing from different directions. Waylon fixed the gate latch, clicked it shut, and turned to face her fully. He was in his work coat, his hat pushed back on his head, his hands calloused and very still at his sides. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to ride to town and see Turner, she said. Not to tell him everything. Enough to know where he stands. Enough to give him the information he needs to make a decision when the time comes. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. And tonight? Tonight I'm going to go through the box again, she said. Everything in it in order with fresh eyes. Because tomorrow I'm going to open it in front of someone I've known for less than a day, and I need to be sure of every page before I do that. He looked at her for a moment. Maren, he said. Yes, this is the right thing, he said. I know you know that already. I'm saying it anyway because I think sometimes it helps to hear it from outside your own head. She looked at him, at the weathered, careful face of a man who was not eloquent and who was nonetheless saying exactly the right thing. Yes, she said, it helps. He picked up his tools. She went inside. That night, she lay in the small, east-facing room and looked at the ceiling and thought about what tomorrow required. She had been carrying the box for 6 months. She had carried it through the last weeks in Abilene when she was afraid to leave the house and on the train west and into a household she did not know, and through 3 weeks of learning this land and these people and this life. The box had been the weight at the center of everything. The thing she was protecting, the thing she was running from, the thing she was moving toward, some resolution she could not yet fully see. Tomorrow she would open it in front of Vera Galt. She would lay its contents on a table and let another person read what was in it. She would share the burden of it, which was also the power of it, which was also the thing she had been most afraid to do. She reached down and touched the iron box in the dark. She thought about Tate Cassidy surviving Chickamauga on stubbornness alone. She thought about Rowan pressing the box into her hands in April and saying there wasn't much time and being right. She thought about what it meant to finish something on behalf of people who could not finish it themselves. She kept her hand on the box. The wind moved off the Cimarron Ridge, and the windmill turned, and the horses shifted in the corral. And somewhere in the house, Waylon Hatch lay awake at the other end of the hall, which was almost certainly what he was doing, because he was a man with much to think about, and few ways to think about it except in the dark. And she knew this about him already 3 weeks in, and she already knew this. She closed her eyes. She slept. The next morning, Maren sat at the kitchen table with Vera Galt and opened the iron box for the first time in another person's presence. Her hands were steady. She had trained them to be steady. It was one of the first things she had trained herself to do after April, after Rowan had pressed the box into her hands and told her there wasn't much time, and she had stood in the hallway of their fine Abilene house and understood all at once that the life she was living had been built on a foundation she had never been permitted to see. Her hands had shaken then. She had trained them out of it. Trembling was information, and she had already given too much information to too many people for too long. She laid the contents on the kitchen table one item at a time, in the order she had established correspondence first, then financial records, then the official documents with Rowan's annotations, and finally the sealed envelope he had marked private. She had not opened the sealed envelope. She had carried it for 6 months without opening it, because opening it felt like a kind of ending she was not ready for. She opened it now with Vera across the table and Waylon standing at the kitchen doorway. It was a letter, 4 pages in Rowan's careful attorney's hand, dated 3 weeks before his death. She read it slowly. He had known he wrote for approximately 2 months before he died since the letter from Tate. He had known that Harlan had orchestrated the theft of the public trust funds, had manipulated territorial court appointments, and had been systematically eliminating anyone who could testify to what he'd done. He had known, he wrote, that he himself was in danger. He had known and he had been afraid, and he had not known what to do with the fear, and while he was deciding what to do with it, the time had run out. He had also written this: I know I was not the husband you deserved. I know I made your world smaller than it should have been. I am sorry for this in ways I do not have the skill to adequately express. I am giving you the box because you are the most capable person I know, and because I do not know anyone else I can trust with it. I hope it gives you something useful. I hope it gives you freedom. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. Vera was watching her. He knew, Maren said. Yes, Vera said gently. He knew about Tate, about the land trust, about all of it. Yes. Maren looked at her hands on the table for a long moment. Something was moving through her that she didn't have a name for, not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but something that encompassed both and extended beyond them into the specific, difficult feeling of understanding a person for the first time after they were no longer present to be understood. He had known and he had not told her. He had managed her the same way he had managed everything, by determining what she needed to know and withholding the rest right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. And then at the end, he had given her the one thing he had that was worth giving and told her she was capable and called it his best guess at an apology. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had made her world smaller and had known that he was making it smaller and had been ashamed of it. She thought about whether what he had given her at the end was enough. She thought it was not enough. She thought it was also not nothing. She thought that some things could be both insufficient and real at the same time, and that the real part didn't cancel out the insufficient part, and neither did the insufficient part cancel out the real part, and that living with that particular mathematics was simply part of what it meant to have loved someone imperfectly and lost them. She looked up. Let's compare documents, she said. They worked for 3 hours. Vera spread Tate Cassidy's materials across the table, and Maren spread hers, and they went through them methodically, Vera reading the entries from Tate's records, while Maren checked them against Rowan's, and then Maren reading from Rowan's while Vera checked against Tate's. The financial records matched. The names were the same, the dates aligned. Not approximately, precisely. The payment amounts that appeared in Harlan's correspondence and Rowan's collection appeared in the financial records Tate had obtained from the Bellard Land Company's former bookkeeper, a man who had left the company under contested circumstances and had been willing in exchange for Tate's help in relocating to California to provide a full accounting of what had passed through the company's accounts. The payments to Harlan were documented from both directions, the outgoing transfer from the Bellard accounts and the incoming receipt from Harlan's own records. There was no interpretation required. The evidence simply stated what it was. What Tate Cassidy had gathered from the outside and what Rowan Holt had gathered from the inside were two halves of the same picture, and together they were overwhelming. Vera sat back and looked at what they had assembled between them. "This is enough," she said. "This is more than enough." Maren looked at the documents on the table. "Then we need to get it to Alderton," she said, "before Harlan gets here." "He's already closer than you think," Vera said. Maren looked at her. "My source in Dodge City sent word yesterday morning," Vera said. "Harlan left Dodge City by train 3 days ago. He has 2 men with him, not investigators this time. He's done with investigators." She paused. "He'll be in Redstone by Saturday." Today was Thursday. Maren pressed her hands flat on the table. "Then we have 2 days," she said. She said it calmly. She felt the specific cold clarity that comes when a deadline becomes concrete, and she let it settle through her and become a tool rather than a fear. 2 days. She knew what 2 days could contain and what they couldn't, and she knew which category each necessary action fell into. "What can you do from here?" she asked Vera. "I can write the narrative document today," Vera said. "The organized summary of the combined evidence, dates, names, amounts, the full chain of the Bellard connection to the Cassidy jurisdiction expansion. Something Alderton can read in an hour and understand in full." She paused. "I can also send a message to my contact at the Federal Circuit, the judge I mentioned. If he receives confirmation from me directly that the evidence is what I've been telling him, he will put pressure on Alderton to move before Harlan's Washington lawyers can file any blocking motions." "Then do both," Maren said. "Today." Vera nodded. "And you," she said, "I need to get a complete second set of copies to Cisco and on his way to Santa Fe today," Maren said. "Not just what I've already sent. Everything including Tate's materials. Both sets together with the cross-reference I'll write this afternoon." She paused. "And I need to talk to Waylon about Turner." She and Waylon talked that night for 2 hours after Lily was in bed. He had a directness in these conversations that she had come to rely on. He didn't dress things up, didn't avoid the hard calculations, didn't pretend the situation was less serious than it was. "Turner," he said, meaning the county sheriff. "He's been cooperative with Bellard, which means he's probably cooperative with Harlan. Can he be worked around?" "Depends on what Harlan brings," Waylon said. "A federal warrant from Alderton outranks anything Turner has. But if Harlan arrives before Alderton moves, Turner could use the time against us." "How much time does Turner give us if we approach him directly?" she said. Waylon thought about this. "Turner's not stupid. He knows the Bellard easement documentation is shaky. I've been making noise about it for months. If Harlan shows up and the case against him is already in federal hands, Turner won't want to be on the wrong side of that." "Then we tell Turner," she said. "Not everything. Enough." Waylon looked at her. "You trust Turner with enough." "I trust his self-interest with enough," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had learned was his version of a smile. Not the movement of his mouth, but something in his eyes. A brief warmth there and then managed away. "All right," he said. "We tell Turner enough." "Something else," she said. "When Harlan comes, and he will come, whether the warrant arrives first or not, I want you to know what I'll do." He looked at her steadily. "If the warrant has arrived, we use it," she said. "Turner won't stop us. The evidence is already in Santa Fe. Harlan can posture and threaten, but he can't reach a federal filing." She paused. "If the warrant hasn't arrived, if Alderton moves too slowly, or Harlan's lawyers file something to delay it, I need you to understand that I won't let him use this ranch as a bargaining chip. I won't let him threaten the water rights or Lily's safety to pressure me." "Meaning," Waylon said. "Meaning if it comes to it, I'll meet him in town, on neutral ground. I'll face him there and I'll tell him directly that everything is already in Alderton's hands and the only thing left is for the process to complete. That there is nothing he can do to me that will undo what's already been done." She looked at the table. "I'd rather that conversation happen in Redstone than on your property." Waylon was quiet for a moment. "That's not going to happen," he said. "Waylon, I mean, he's not going to get within talking distance of you without me present," he said. That's not a debate I'm willing to have. He paused. I understand what you're doing. You're managing the situation. You're finding the angle. I've watched you do it for 3 weeks, and I think it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen a person do. He paused. But there are some situations where finding the angle means you end up carrying everything yourself, and I'm not going to let that happen. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. I'm not used to that, she said. I know, he said. I'm telling you anyway. She looked at him for a long time, at the face that was weathered and careful, and she permitted herself to see this now genuinely decent in the specific, unglamorous way that genuine decency works, not loudly, not romantically, but steadily, day after day, in small decisions made when no one was watching. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. I'm going to check the north fence before dark, he said. You should eat something. She almost laughed. You're worried about the fence. I'm worried about the fence, and I'm worried about you, he said. The fence at least I can do something about tonight. He went out. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about a man who was going to check his fence in the cold before dark because that was what needed to be done and that was who he was. And she thought, I am in very serious trouble here, and I would not trade it for anything. She wrote the message to Alderton that night. Cisco had returned from his Santa Fe route 2 days earlier, and she found him before dawn the next morning and paid him a premium to ride again immediately. He looked at her face and at the sealed packet in her hand and didn't ask any questions. There and back as fast as you can, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. She watched him ride north in the cold pre-dawn and thought about the 2 days she had and what she needed to do with them. Vera Gold spent Friday writing at the boarding house table organizing the combined evidence into a narrative document that could be published in the Albuquerque Courier the moment the federal case was opened. Maren had asked her to hold it until then. Vera had agreed with the professional composure of a journalist who understood that a story published too soon is a story that can be suppressed. Waylon went to see Turner on Friday afternoon. He came back an hour later and sat at the kitchen table. Turner will not cooperate with Harlan without seeing Harlan's federal warrant, he said. If Harlan can't produce one, and if Alderton moves first, Turner will stand aside. That's something, Maren said. It's not nothing, Waylon agreed. What did you tell him? That the Bellard easement was fraudulently filed and that there was a federal investigation already opened. I didn't give him names. He paused. He already knew. He didn't say so, but he knew. He's been waiting to see which way the wind goes. Maren looked at him. And now he knows the wind is going against Harlan, she said. I think so, Waylon said. I think he's been waiting for someone to tell him it's safe to know that. They sat in the kitchen, and outside the wind moved off the mesa cold and steady. Lily was in her room with her schoolwork. The iron box sat on the kitchen shelf open now, its contents organized and copied and partially en route to Santa Fe. Lily knew something was happening. She was 9 years old, and she had her father's particular gift for reading the temperature of a room, and she had spent 3 weeks watching Maren with the serious, comprehensive attention she turned on anything important. On Thursday evening, the night before Harlan was due to arrive, she came to the kitchen doorway and stood there in her nightgown with her arms crossed in the posture that meant she was preparing to ask a question she was not entirely sure she had the right to ask. Is something bad coming? She said. Maren looked up from the papers. She thought about how to answer this. She had spent 3 years being managed by someone who answered every difficult question with something smooth and untrue, and she had learned from the inside out how much that costs. A difficult situation is coming, she said. Not dangerous, not in the way that means anyone's going to be hurt. But a man is coming to town who is going to try to take me away from here, and I'm going to make sure he can't. Lily stood in the doorway and absorbed this. Is he the one you ran from? She said. Maren looked at her steadily. Yes. And you're not going to run again? No, Maren said. I'm done running. Lily thought about this with the serious, careful thinking face that looked so much like Waylon's. It sometimes caught Maren off guard, that particular quality of a person giving a question the full weight it deserved. What are we going to do? She said. Maren noted the we without remarking on it. Tomorrow morning before school, she said. I'm going to meet with a woman at the boarding house in town. She's a journalist. She writes for a newspaper in Albuquerque. She has information that, together with mine, is enough to stop the man who's coming. She paused. Your father is going to ride to see the sheriff, and a federal attorney in Santa Fe has been given everything he needs to open a formal case. What do I do? Lily asked. You go to school, Maren said. You have your arithmetic examination on Friday. Lily's expression shifted very slightly. That's not what I meant, she said. I know, Maren said. I'm telling you the most important thing you can do, which is to let the people who are handling this handle it. You being at school safe is what I need. Lily stood in the doorway for another moment. All right, she said. She started to turn away, then stopped. Maren. Yes. He's not going to take you, she said. Not a question, a declaration. No, Maren said, he's not. Lily went to bed. Maren sat for a long time after looking at the papers and thinking about a 9-year-old girl who had lost her mother and kept her father's secrets and was prepared with remarkable composure to claim a woman she'd known for 3 weeks as someone worth fighting for. She had not expected to be claimed. She had not thought to want it. She understood now that she had been wrong about both. Saturday came. Judge Harlan Cassidy arrived in Redstone in the early afternoon on a gray horse, with 2 men she had never seen before flanking him. They were not investigators. They were the kind of men Harlan kept for situations that had moved past investigation. Larger men, quieter men, men whose purpose was less to ask questions than to discourage the asking of them. He looked older than she remembered. The months since Rowan's funeral had not been gentle. But his composure was intact, the specific composure of a man who has calculated every angle in a room before he enters it and who has never yet entered a room he could not control. He came to the ranch. Maren was in the kitchen when she heard the horses in the yard. She looked out the window and saw them. She looked at the iron box on the shelf now containing only the copies the originals were in Alderton's hands by now, or very nearly. She had Vera's copies. She had everything she needed. She had prepared for this. She took a breath. She went out. The yard was ordinary in the way that yards are ordinary. The corral, the barn, the windmill turning in the cold, the red earth going pale in the November light. She stood in the middle of it and watched Harlan ride through the gate and pull up his horse, and she felt the particular quality of this moment, the convergence of 6 months of preparation with the reality she had been preparing for, and she let herself feel it fully, and then she set it aside because there was no room right now for feeling. Maren, Harlan said when he saw her come through the door. He said her name with the particular warmth of a man who has decided warmth is the most effective opening position, the warmth of a man who has used the same warmth in 100 courtrooms and has never once had it fail him. There you are. You had us all worried. Harlan, she said. Waylon had come from the barn. He stood at the edge of the yard equidistant between her and the riders, with his hat pushed back on his head and his face showing nothing useful. His hands were at his sides. Still, ready. I've come to bring you home, Harlan said. You've had a difficult time. Grief makes us do things we wouldn't ordinarily do. He looked briefly at Waylon with the specific dismissal of a man who considers obstacles rather than people. This arrangement, no one blames you. Rowan's death was hard on everyone. Rowan's death, she said. A brief flicker. He hadn't expected her to stop him there. Of course. You were in shock. You made a decision that I stand behind, she said. Something hardened in his face. The warmth became its own opposite, not quite cold, but the specific temperature of a man recalculating his position. Maren. His voice changed, not threatening, not yet. The temperature of quiet authority, the voice of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. I have with me a document from the Missouri Circuit requiring you to appear in Kansas to complete the administration of Rowan's estate. There are records that need to be examined, documents that may be relevant to certain proceedings. There are, she agreed pleasantly. They're in Santa Fe. He went very still. They arrived yesterday morning, she said, along with a full account of the trust fund disbursements, the Bellard Land Company payments, the altered survey filings, and a complete history of the territorial jurisdiction expansion you arranged 4 months ago. She watched his face carefully. Federal Attorney Alderton has been in receipt of those materials since approximately yesterday noon. I expect he's had time to read them by now. Harlan stood very still on his gray horse. You're making a serious mistake, he said. I've thought about that carefully, she said. I don't believe I am. He looked at Waylon. His eyes made the calculation that a man like Harlan always makes the assessment of what can be used, what can be pressured, where the leverage is. He was looking for a way to make this situation cost someone something. That was how he operated. That was what she had been preparing for. Your water rights dispute, he said to Waylon. The Bellard easement is legally filed. Is fraudulently filed, Waylon said, en tone. His voice was completely even. as the territorial surveyor will confirm when he arrives next week, as the federal case against you will demonstrate in considerable detail. Harlan looked from one of them to the other, and Maren watched him make the calculation she had been waiting for him to make, the slow, cold recognition that the situation was not what he had prepared for. That he had ridden into this yard expecting a frightened woman with a box of papers she didn't know how to use, and found instead a woman who had spent 6 months learning exactly how to use them with a room full of witnesses and a federal attorney already reading. Sheriff Turner, he said, is aware of the federal investigation, Maren said. I believe he mentioned it to you this morning. He mentioned it to me this afternoon. A silence that had weight in it. Harlan Cassidy looked at her across the yard of the Hatch Ranch in the cold November afternoon, with the red mesa behind her and the enormous, patient sky overhead. And she looked back at him, and she did not look away, and she was not afraid. She thought about Rowan pressing the box into her hands in April. She thought about the train platform in Dodge City. She thought about the first evening in this kitchen, sitting across from a man she didn't know, with an iron box in her lap and a story she couldn't tell yet. She thought about 3 weeks of learning what she had been wrong about and what she had been right about and what was still possible. She thought, I am standing in my yard. This is my yard. He has no authority here. This isn't finished, Harlan said. No, she said. It isn't, but it's begun, and you're not going to stop it from here. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. She watched him ride out of the yard with his 2 men behind him, and she stood in the cold afternoon and breathed, and Waylon came to stand beside her and did not touch her and did not say anything and was simply there, which was, she thought, exactly what she needed. He'll go back to Dodge City and regroup, she said. Probably, Waylon said. He'll find a way to complicate the federal case. He has connections. Probably, Waylon said again. This is not over. No, he said, but today it's over. She looked at the gate where Harlan's horse had been. Today it's over, she said. Lily appeared in the doorway of the house, her serious face tracking them with the careful assessment she turned on everything important. Is he gone? She said. For now, Waylon said. Lily looked from her father to Maren and back. Good, she said, and went back inside. Maren stood in the yard and looked at the mesa going dark against the sky, and she thought about the iron box on the kitchen shelf and Vera Galt writing at the boarding house table, and Cisco somewhere on the road to Santa Fe, and the letter Rowan had written her that she had read once and folded carefully and would need to read again many times before she understood all of what it meant. She thought about hope and whether what she was feeling now was the same hope she had felt 3 weeks ago or something larger. She thought it might be something larger. The weeks after Harlan's departure from the ranch yard had the particular quality of an aftermath, not peace exactly, but the absence of immediate danger, which is its own form of rest. The air in the house was different. She noticed it in Lily first, a loosening around the shoulders, a return of the humming, then in Waylon, who seemed to breathe from a different depth. Maren permitted herself no such loosening. She knew better. Alderton wrote from Santa Fe 4 days after Harlan left. The federal case was open. The materials had been received and reviewed, and where Alderton wrote among the most complete and carefully organized evidentiary packages he had seen in 20 years of federal practice. He complimented her work with the dry precision of a man who gives compliments rarely and means them when he does. He also wrote, Cassidy has retained counsel in Washington. This will take time, and he will fight every step of it. Prepare for months, not weeks. Do not relax your vigilance. She read this twice and filed it under known things. Harlan's territorial jurisdiction over New Mexico was suspended pending review, which meant the Bellard Land Company's easement claim was in immediate limbo. The territorial surveyor arrived the following Tuesday, as Waylon had predicted, and spent 2 days walking the north boundary with his instruments and his notebooks. He was a thin, precise man named Godwin, who said very little but looked at everything, and when he left, he had in his saddlebags enough documentation to invalidate the fraudulent easement filing permanently. The water rights resolution would take months more, but the immediate threat to the North Spring was lifted, and that mattered. She watched Waylon's face when Godwin left, watched the careful, contained quality of his relief. A man who has been waiting for a long time for permission to believe something, and who, now that the permission has arrived, doesn't quite know what to do with it yet. She knew that quality. She had been wearing it herself. Dora Kinsley came to the ranch on a Thursday in early December. She came without her apron. Just herself, Dora. The woman, not Dora, the household arrangement. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said what she had come to say. I'm going to Colorado, she said. My sister married a man in Denver. There's more for me there than here. She looked at Maren with the directness of a woman who has stopped being oblique. I hope you understand why I came here, what I was trying to do. I think I do, Maren said. You were here for Lily. Dora looked at her with something that was surprised and then wasn't. Adeline and I were close, she said quietly, closer than most people knew. When she left, I felt responsible. For Lily, I told myself it was about Lily. She paused. It was mostly about Lily. Mostly, Maren said. Dora almost smiled. Mostly. She set down her cup. Waylon is a good man. I think I knew even at the start that what I wanted and what he needed weren't going to be the same thing. But it took time to know it clearly. She looked at Maren. I see what's here. I've seen it for a while. Maren did not say anything. Be good to them, Dora said. Both of them. I intend to, Maren said. They shook hands. It was the handshake of two women who had been in complicated proximity and had come through it without injury, and that was more than either of them might have predicted in October. She stood at the window and watched Dora walk back toward town, and she thought about the months of careful presents, the pressed curtains, the dried flowers, the good coffee, all of it, and she thought it cost her something to come here and something to leave, and she did both with dignity. She hoped Denver was kind to her. Lily cried a little when she heard. Not much. Lily was not built for prolonged crying, but a little, and Maren sat on the floor of her room, back against the wall below eye level, and they talked about leaving and how people carry the places they've been with them, and how it is possible to love something and still move away from it and still be fine. Lily thought about this with her customary seriousness. Did you love Abilene? She asked. I loved my father's office, Maren said. I loved the river in spring. Some of the people. She paused. I didn't love the life I had there, but you can love pieces of a place even when the whole isn't right for you. Do you love it here? Lily asked. Maren looked at this child with her rock collection and her serious face and her 9 years of born knowledge. Yes, she said, I love it here. Lily looked at her for a moment. Good, she said, because you're ours. Maren had not expected that. She had not expected the certainty of it or the simplicity of it, and she sat on the floor of Lilia's room for a long moment after the girl went to bed and thought about the word ours with its plain possessive weight offered without condition or qualification, and she understood that she had been given something by a 9-year-old that she had not received from many adults, and that it was worth more than she could say. December settled over the Cimarron Ridge with a cold that was clean and dry. Not the damp gray cold of Kansas, but something crystalline. The kind of cold that makes the air taste like iron and the stars at night seem close enough to touch. She had been at the ranch 2 months. She had stopped counting the days sometime around mid-November, which she recognized as a kind of milestone, the moment when you stop measuring a place by when you arrived and start measuring it by what comes next. The evenings had found their rhythm, Lily in her room with her schoolwork, the house contracting to its nighttime configuration. Waylon at the far end of the table, Maren across from him, the lamp between them, and whatever came naturally. He was teaching her the land she realized, not deliberately, not as a formal arrangement, but in the way of a man who loves a thing and cannot help showing it. He taught her which ridgeline caught the morning frost first and which was protected by the thermal rise off the south face. He taught her the signs of a well going dry versus one merely running slow. He taught her the specific seasonal behavior of the Cimarron water, how the spring ran strong in winter, from the snowmelt and slowed in June before the summer rains came. He taught her which horses were smart in the way that made them unreliable, and which were smart in the way that made them safe. She taught him other things. She taught him that the Bellard Land Company's original territorial charter contained an arbitration clause that their attorney had apparently never noticed, which meant the surveyor's ruling could be accelerated significantly. She taught him indirectly through the conversation that happened one evening about Tocqueville that he was better at abstract reasoning than he thought he was, and that what he called not having much school was not the same as not being educated. She taught him over the course of many evenings that silence was not the only form of communication available to him. He was learning this last thing slowly in the way that people learn things that require them to undo habits formed over years of living alone. On a Wednesday evening in December, he told her something he had not told anyone. They were at the kitchen table with the lamp in the cold outside and Lily asleep down the hall, and Waylon was holding his coffee cup without drinking from it and looking at the table with the expression she now recognized as the approach to something difficult. I told you that Adeline left because I wasn't present, he said. Yes, she said carefully. That was true, he said. But it wasn't the whole truth. He set the cup down. She left because I asked her to go. Maren was quiet. Not I didn't tell her to leave, he said. But she told me she was miserable. She told me she had met someone. She told me she wanted to go. He looked at the table. And I said that if she was going, she should go. Because staying out of obligation was going to poison Lily more than leaving would. You let her go, Maren said. Yes, he exhaled slowly. And then I told people she died. Because I was ashamed of the choice I'd made. Not of letting her go, I still think that was right. I was ashamed that I had failed at something so completely that the honest answer was worse than a lie. Maren sat with this. What would you have told Lily, she said, if you hadn't been ashamed? He thought about it. That her mother was a person who needed a different life, he said. That some people are not made for the same things. That it had nothing to do with Lily and nothing to do with any fault in her mother, just a wrong match made too young between two people who wanted different things. He paused. The truth. That's a good answer, Maren said. It's 5 years too late, he said. Tell it to her now, she said. It's still the same truth. He looked at her across the lamp. You do that, he said. Do what? Make the thing that seems too late seem still possible, he said. I mean to say I find it useful. To be near. He stopped as though the words had come out slightly differently than he'd shaped them and looked away. She looked at her hands on the table. I've had practice, she said. In Abilene, everything seemed too late for a long time. I learned to look for what was still openable. What is still openable, he said, for you? She looked up at him. A great deal, she said, more than I expected when I got off that train. He held her gaze. The lamp was steady between them. Outside the window, the stars were very bright, and the wind moved off the ridge and the windmill turned in the dark. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know that the answer isn't going to change anything about... He stopped. I want to ask you something without it feeling like a trap. Ask me, she said. When the case is over, he said, when Harlan is resolved, whatever that looks like, when you have your freedom and you've done what you came here to do. He paused. What do you want? She heard the question beneath the question. She thought about it seriously the way it deserved to be thought about. She thought about all the times she had answered questions of this kind by calculating what the asker needed to hear and providing it. She thought about all the times she had translated wanting into practicality and called the translation honesty. She thought about what it would mean to simply answer what was true. I want to stay, she said, not because I have nowhere else to go. I'll have options when this is over. I'm aware of that. She met his eyes. I want to stay because I have chosen this. The ranch and Lily and the water rights in all of it. A pause. And you. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said, not relief, something quieter than relief. The steadiness of a thing that has been possible for a while and is now real. There's more hard work ahead, she said. The federal case, Harlan's appeals, the surveyor's ruling, and whatever Bellard does in response. I know, he said. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when the hard days come. Maren, he said, I've been working this land for 11 years. I know what hard days look like. She almost smiled. So do I. I know you do, he said. And something in his voice said that is one of the things about you. Waylon talked to Lily before Christmas. He did it in the evening after supper, in the careful, incremental way that Maren had suggested, not attempting to deliver the complete truth all at once, but to open the door and let Lily see that the door could be opened. Maren was in her room when it happened. She could hear them through the wall. Not the words exactly, but the rhythm of it. Waylon's voice low and careful, and Lily's responses, in the particular quality of the silence between responses, that was the silence of a child thinking hard about something that matters. It went on for 20 minutes. Then she heard Lily's door close, and then Waylon's footsteps in the hall, and then the sound of him in the kitchen, the specific sounds of a man who needs to do something with his hands after something difficult. She waited 10 minutes. Then she went to the kitchen. He was at the table with his coffee, looking at the window that faced north toward the ridge. How did it go? She said. He looked up at her. She said she already knew, he said. Most of it. Yes, she said she'd known since summer. He turned the cup in his hands. She said she didn't tell me because she was worried about how I'd take it. She was protecting you, Maren said. I know, he looked at the table. 9 years old and she's been managing me. She learned it, Maren said carefully. Children learn what the household requires. She learned that you needed to be protected from certain things, and she did what the household required. He was quiet for a moment. That's a kind way to say it, he said. It's an accurate way, she said. She's not damaged by it. She's very competent, but she shouldn't have had to be competent in that particular way. He looked at her. She asked me why I told people Adeline died, he said slowly. I told her the truth, that I was ashamed, that I had failed at something, and the honest answer was worse than a lie, and I chose the lie because I was too. He stopped. Broken, Maren said. Yes. He looked up at her. She said, it's all right, Papa. I know you did the best you knew. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved off the ridge. That's more forgiveness than you gave yourself, Maren said. More than I deserve, he said. Children are more generous than we deserve sometimes, she said. It's one of the more remarkable things about them. He looked at his coffee. She asked me something else, he said. She asked if you were going to stay. Maren was quiet. What did you tell her, she said. He looked up at her. I told her I hope so, he said. I told her I was working in it. She looked at him. At the lamp between them, at the ordinary kitchen of a house that was becoming against all practical planning, something she wanted rather than merely needed. That's a reasonable answer, she said. Is it enough, he said. She met his eyes. For now, she said, ask me again in spring. Survey the Cat arrived on a Thursday 6 days before Christmas. He appeared at the barn door in the evening, when Waylon was doing the last feeding a half-grown orange cat with the proprietary air of an animal that has assessed the situation and found it suitable. Waylon brought him to the house. He jumped immediately to the kitchen windowsill and arranged himself there with the settled composure of a creature who has made a permanent decision. Lily claimed not to know where he had come from. Maren, watching Lily's studiously neutral expression, concluded that the cat had been the result of some negotiation with Alice Marsh's older sister, who had a barn cat with a litter she was distributing. She also concluded that a 9-year-old who had spent 5 months managing a painful family secret was probably entitled to obtain a cat through whatever means she found practical. She said nothing about the cat's origins. Waylon, who had arrived at the same conclusion through faster reasoning, also said nothing. Lily named the cat Survey, she said, after the territorial surveyor, because he had a very precise way of looking at things. Maren had laughed at that quickly from somewhere genuine, and Lily had looked pleased, and Waylon had looked at both of them with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of happiness. Quiet contained not theatrical, but entirely real. She was learning to recognize it because she was learning to pay attention to things that were real rather than things that were performed, and Waylon's happiness was among the most real things in her daily life. On a Saturday afternoon in late December, 3 days before the new year, Maren went to the barn to check on Mesa, who had been slightly off his feed, and found Waylon there already standing with his hand on the gray's neck and talking to him in a low voice. He heard her come in. He didn't turn around. He's all right, he said. Just the cold. I thought so, she said. She came to stand beside him. The barn was warm with hay and animal heat, and the cold outside made the warmth inside particular and good, and she stood beside him at Mesa's stall, and they were both quiet for a moment. He turned and looked at her. She had learned to read his face, learned all the small gradations of it, the expression of calculation, the expression of attention, the expression of the approach to something difficult. She knew all of these now. This was a new one. Maren, he said. Yes, she said. He reached out and very carefully, very deliberately put his hand against her face, one calloused palm against her cheek, the touch of a man who is holding something he is not entirely sure he has the right to hold, and who knows the difference between claiming something and being given it. She put her hand over his. I'm not good at saying things, he said. I think you know that. I do, she said. I'm going to try anyway. All right. He looked at her. I didn't know what I was asking for when I placed that advertisement, he said. I knew what I needed. I didn't know what I was asking for. His thumb moved very slightly against her cheek. And then you got off the train. She was quiet. You are the most capable person I have ever known, he said, and the most careful, and the most, he stopped. You're not afraid of any of the things that I've been afraid of since I built this place. The difficulty, the isolation, the hard days. He shook his head slightly. You don't call them hard days. You call them workable. Most of them are, she said. The ones that are because you find the way to make them so. He looked at her. I want you to know that I see that. That I don't take it for something that's just there that doesn't cost anything. I see what it costs. She felt her throat tighten slightly. She was not accustomed to being seen that clearly. She had been looked at and admired and described and defined by people who were seeing something other than what was actually there. She had been called exceptional by a man who found her exceptional the way he found a good piece of furniture exceptional, something worth displaying, something that reflected well on its owner. She had been watched and assessed and found wanting by people who wanted her to be smaller. She had been called capable by a man who was already dead when he said it. This was different. Thank you, she said. I'm not finished, he said. She waited. I care about you, he said. More than is practical, more than I planned for, more than... He stopped. I care about you the way I care about this land. Not because I have to, because I chose to and the choosing made it mine, and now it is. She looked at him. You're comparing me to your land, she said. I know. Something moved in his face. I told you I wasn't good at this. No, she said. You are. That is exactly right. She stepped toward him. He was still holding her face, and she put both hands against his chest, and she looked at him, at the weathered, careful, genuinely decent face of a man who had named horses after the landscape he loved, who had moved his coffee jar without ceremony, who had checked his fence in the cold before dark, because that was what needed to be done. And she said, Waylon Hatch, you are the most workable man I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. Real from somewhere deep, and she laughed with him, and in the warm barn, with the gray horse watching them with equine patience, and the cold pressing at the walls, they stood together and laughed, and it was right. It was exactly right, in the same way that silence had been right between them for weeks. He kissed her once very carefully, the way he did most things deliberately without ceremony, meaning every part of it. Outside, the wind moved off the Cimarron Ridge, and the year was nearly over, and the stars were beginning to appear in the early dark of December. And inside the barn, a man and a woman stood together in the warmth and held on, and it was a beginning. That evening, Lily came to the barn to say supper was ready and found them. She looked at them. She looked at her father's hand on Maren's arm. She looked at her father's face open and unguarded and showing for once exactly what it held. She looked at Maren. Finally, she said, and went back to the house. Maren looked at Waylon. Waylon looked at Maren. And for the second time that evening in the warm barn, with the old horse watching them with patient equine wisdom, they laughed the shared, genuine, helpless laughter of two people who have been given the most accurate possible verdict on their situation by a 9-year-old girl with a gift for precise assessment. January arrived with snow. Not the deep blanketing snow she had grown up with in Topeka, the kind that settled over the plains like a judgment and stayed for months gray and heavy and final. This was something different. An inch, perhaps two, sifted down overnight onto the red earth, crystalline and precise, and the whole landscape turned alien and strange and beautiful in the early morning light, red showing through white in patches like embers, banked low, like something very old, sleeping under something new. She stood at the east window of her room in the early quiet and watched it, and she thought, I have a window I think of as mine. I have a landscape I think of as mine. Both of these things happened without my quite noticing, and they are true regardless. She had been allowing herself to use the word home for 3 weeks now. It fit. The article appeared in the Albuquerque Courier on the 14th of January. Vera Gold had written it with the controlled precision of a journalist who understands that the most dangerous stories must be constructed most carefully. Every fact sourced, every claim and attributable, every figure documented so thoroughly that the only honest response to it is silence or surrender. The headline read, Federal investigation opens into Kansas Circuit Judge, land fraud and corruption alleged in 3 territories. It was the kind of headline that traveled. By the time Waylon rode into Redstone for supplies 3 days after the paper arrived, the whole town already knew. Mrs. Fogarty at the boarding house had read it aloud at the breakfast table 2 mornings running. The men at the feed store had discussed it at length and were apparently still discussing it. Turner at the sheriff's office had looked at Waylon over the counter with an expression that was very close to relief, the expression of a man who has been waiting to know which way a thing will fall and has finally been told. Turner said the territorial governor's office contacted him about the Bellard easement. Waylon told her that evening, setting his hat on the peg by the door and coming to the kitchen table where she was working. The company's legal team withdrew its January enforcement claim yesterday. Maren set down her pen. They withdrew, she said, yesterday morning. She looked at the kitchen shelf where the iron box sat empty, now its contents in Santa Fe in federal custody, properly archived and cataloged. The box itself was simply a box again. a small iron container that a man had pressed into his wife's hands on an April afternoon in Abilene, telling her there wasn't much time. She had kept it safe. "The North Water is yours," she said. He looked at her across the table, and his expression did what she had learned it sometimes did. It became something she did not have a clean word for, something that included all the long difficulty of the previous 9 years, and the fact of her sitting across from him in the lamplight, in the distance between those two things. "The North Water is ours," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of what that small word contained. "Yes," she said, "ours." The letter from Harlan's legal counsel arrived in the second week of February. It was 3 pages written on expensive stationery, in the careful language of men who are paid to sound reasonable while being entirely otherwise. It proposed that in exchange for Maren withdrawing her cooperation with the federal investigation, the estate of Rowan Holt would be settled in full, with a generous sum released to her directly, and all outstanding claims against the property dismissed. It also suggested in the elegant, oblique language that such letters favor, that continued cooperation with the federal process would be costly in ways both financial and reputational. She read it twice. She set it down. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment, with her hands flat on the wood surface, and thought about Harlan Cassidy in his courtroom in Dodge City, the black robe, the composed authority, the precise patience of a man who had never once been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. Then she picked up her pen and wrote her response. 1 page, 4 sentences. She showed it to Waylon before she sealed it. He read it, he set it down. "Short," he said. "I said what needed saying," she said. He looked at her with the expression that was not quite pride and not quite tenderness, but contained both and other things besides. "Yes," he said, "you always do." She sent the letter through the county post the next morning. She did not hear from Harlan's counsel again. The formal water rights ruling came on a Thursday in late February. 12 pages of precise legal language delivered by the Territorial Surveyor's Office, with the dry efficiency of a document that has been anticipated for a long time and does not intend to apologize for making anyone wait. It resolved without ambiguity or qualification that the Bellard Land Company's easement filing had been executed with fraudulently altered documentation, that the survey markers had been duplicated and incorrectly registered, and that the North Spring water rights belonged to the Hatch property under the original 1871 territorial grant without interruption or qualification. The conclusion was final. It was not subject to appeal within the territorial system. And it had come, the ruling made clear, not because anyone had been generous, but because the evidence was overwhelming and the conclusion was the only honest one the surveyor could reach. Waylon read it at this kitchen table on a Thursday morning while Lily was at school and the coffee was still hot, and Survey was doing his morning arrangement of himself on the windowsill. He read it all the way through once. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. 9 years, he said. She did not say anything. She let him have the silence. 9 years of farming around it, he said, keeping the south pasture light because I wasn't certain what rights held up north. Not putting water line to the east meadow because the whole thing felt like it could be pulled out from under me at any moment. He looked at the ruling. The north meadow. I've never used it the way it should be used. The grass up there, there's good grass along the spring. I've always known it, and I've always stayed off it. What would you do with it? She asked. He looked up at her. In spring, he said, I'd like to ride up and look at it, what it could be. He paused. I'd like you to come. She understood that he was not entirely talking about the meadow. Yes, she said, I would like that very much. He held her gaze for a moment, steady, warm, unguarded in the way he was becoming more comfortable being in her presence. And then he looked back down at the ruling, and she watched him do what she had observed him do for months, quietly, without announcement, place his weight on the new reality and find it solid. 9 years, he said again, quietly, not with bitterness, with something more complicated than bitterness, the particular exhale of a man who has been braced for a long time and is finally carefully allowing himself to let his shoulders down. Vera Galt's second article appeared in the Courier in the last week of February. It was more detailed than the first and more specific and considerably more devastating, because the first article had told the public what had happened and the second article showed them exactly how. The financial records were reproduced in summary. The names of 3 territorial judges who had been appointed through Harlan's influence were documented alongside their subsequent rulings, which showed a pattern so consistent it could not be explained as coincidence and could not be dismissed as interpretation. The Bellard Land Company's payment history was laid out in clean columns that any reader with basic arithmetic could follow. It was the kind of journalism that cannot be suppressed after the fact. Once it is in print, it is in the archive. Once it is in the archive, it is permanent. Maren read it at the kitchen table and thought about Tate Cassidy, a man she had never met who had survived Chickamauga on stubbornness alone, and come west and spent 3 years gathering from the outside what Rowan gathered from the inside, and who had died of cholera in Albuquerque in the summer of 1878 with his case still open. She thought he can read this wherever the dead go. He can see that it was finished. She hoped that was a comfort. She thought it probably was. It was on a Wednesday evening in late February that Lily announced her intentions. She came home from school and set her bag on the chair by the door and her lunch pail on the table with the particular efficiency of a child who has been thinking about something all day and has finally organized it into a form suitable for presentation. "Mrs. Greer says women can't be lawyers," she said, sitting down across from Maren. Maren looked up from the survey document she was annotating. She thought about how to answer this. She had spent 3 years in Abilene being managed by someone who answered difficult questions with something smooth and untrue, and she had learned from the inside out how much that cost not just to the person being managed, but to the relationship, to the trust, to the sense that truth is something anyone is willing to say out loud. She was not going to do that to Lily. "Mrs. Greer is technically correct that women are currently not admitted to most bar associations in the United States," she said. "She is incorrect that this will always be true." Lily sat down across from her. "How do you know it won't always be true?" "Because the argument for excluding women from law is not a good argument," Maren said. "It is a practical arrangement that benefits the people who currently hold the positions. Practical arrangements that benefit the people who hold positions tend to change when those people change or when the cost of maintaining the arrangement becomes higher than the benefit." Lily's expression shifted, the slow, careful shift of a very intelligent child processing something genuinely new. "Is that what happened with the water rights?" she said. "The Bellard people thought the arrangement benefited them, so they kept it." Maren looked at her. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what happened. And it stopped working for them when the cost got too high. When the evidence made maintaining the arrangement more expensive than abandoning it," Maren said. "Yes, that is precisely what happened." Lily turned this over. "So the way to change things," she said slowly, "is to make the cost of not changing higher than the cost of changing." "Often," Maren said, "or to find the people who have the authority to change it and give them a reason to use it." She paused. "Both at once is best." Lily nodded slowly with the deliberate expression of someone filing important information in a place where it will be easy to find. "I'm going to be a lawyer," she said. Maren looked at her steadily. "You're 9 years old," she said. "I know," Lily said. "I have time to prepare." She picked up her school bag and went to her room to do her arithmetic without another word on the subject, in the manner of a person who has stated a conclusion and considers the discussion complete. Maren sat at the kitchen table and looked at the doorway through which Lily had disappeared, and she felt something move through her chest that she recognized now without needing to examine it. It was simply love, uncomplicated and specific, the kind that comes from watching someone be exactly who they are. She had not planned for this. She had planned for practical, and she had found something that included practical and extended considerably beyond it in every direction. When Waylon came in from the barn an hour later and found her still sitting at the kitchen table with a small expression he had learned to recognize as the expression of a woman who has just had something happen inside herself, she told him what Lily had said. He stood in the doorway and listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She's going to be something," he said. "Yes," Maren said, "she is." He came and sat at the table and picked up his coffee, and they both looked at the doorway to the back of the house where Lily's lamp was still on, and neither of them said anything more, because sometimes what you feel is too exact for words, and you do better to simply sit with it. The formal federal charges against Judge Harlan Cassidy were filed on a Tuesday in the first week of April. 18 counts across 3 territories: fraud, bribery, theft from a public trust conspiracy to falsify official court documents, and the manipulation of territorial judicial appointments for personal financial benefit. His Washington attorney issued a statement calling the charges politically motivated and promising a vigorous defense. The statement appeared in several newspapers. It did not appear in the Albuquerque Courier because Vera Gall had already run her 3rd article that same afternoon, the one with the financial records reproduced in their entirety, the one that named every payment and every ruling and every date. And by the time the Washington attorney's statement arrived, the Courier's readers had already read something considerably more informative. Turner came to the ranch the next morning. She heard the horses in the yard and came out to find him standing at the gate with his hat in his hands, which was not his habitual manner. He was a man who generally wore his authority comfortably, even in difficult situations. This morning he looked like someone carrying something he was glad to set down. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to tell you personally. The charges are filed. The county's position on the Bellard water rights is formally resolved. Any future dispute goes through the territorial court." He paused. "Not the circuit." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. He turned his hat twice in his hands. "I should tell you I knew the Bellard situation wasn't right. I knew it for 2 years. I didn't know how far it went, but I knew the easement documentation had problems." He met her eyes. "I should have moved sooner, I know that." She looked at him for a moment. "You moved when you could," she said. "That's what matters now." He nodded. He put his hat back on. "You've done something considerable here," he said. "I want you to know I understand that." "Several people did something considerable here," she said. "I had help." He went. She stood in the yard after the sound of his horse faded and looked at the outbuildings and the corral and the windmill turning in the April morning. The sage along the ridge was coming in that particular fierce green of desert spring, brief and brilliant. The air smelled like new water and something she had been trying to name for weeks and had finally named possibility. She thought about a woman stepping down from a train in October with an iron box and $287 in a practical plan and no room left in herself for anything beyond survival. She thought about that woman with something close to affection. She went inside. Waylon was at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts, his reading glasses pushed to the top of his forehead. She had discovered the reading glasses in February. She had found them privately one of the most endearing things she had ever seen, not because they made him look different, but because they were the one small domestic detail he was slightly self-conscious about, the one crack in the composed, practical exterior through which something purely human showed. She had never said this. She had simply filed it in the place where she kept things worth knowing. He looked up when she came in. "Turner," he said. "Charges filed," she said. 18 counts. She sat across from him. "It's done, the worst of it." He set down his pen. He looked at her across the table with the lamp between them and Survey asleep in the iron box on the shelf and the April light coming through the window over his shoulder. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Today, right now." She thought about it. "Ride up to the North Meadow," she said, "just to see it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, the specific warmth she had learned to recognize as his version of everything being right. "Then let's go," he said. They rode north in the April morning, the two of them with Survey, having attempted to follow them from the yard, and having been gently redirected by Tomas, who had come for his biannual roof check and was more than equal to the task of containing a determined orange cat. The sage was coming in along the ridge trail. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of new water from the snowmelt, and the sky above the Cimarron was that specific deep April blue she had come to think of as the color of being in the right place. They rode without hurrying. The horses were easy under them. She had been thinking since February about what to say when they reached the meadow. She had drafted several versions in the particular way she did things, methodically from the outside edges, inward, establishing the perimeter before attempting the interior. She had rejected several versions as too careful, too managed, too much the language of a woman who had spent years making herself fit inside spaces that did not fit. She was not going to do that. The North Meadow opened before them as the trail crested the last low rise, and she stopped Mesa and looked at it and forgot for a moment what she had planned to say. It was green. In April in the desert, genuinely and startlingly green, the grass thick and new along the spring's edge, the water running clear and cold over pale rock, the ridge face rising behind it in layers of red and orange, and the deep rust of iron-rich stone. A stand of cottonwood marked the spring's upper reach, their new leaves shaking silver in the breeze. The whole flat was perhaps half an acre, hemmed by rock on two sides, and opened on the third to the long view south. The ranch buildings visible, small and solid below the windmill, turning the corrals and the barn and the house with its east-facing window, catching the morning light. "Oh," she said. He had been watching her face. "Yes," he said. They dismounted and walked to the spring. The water was cold enough that it ached. She tested it with her fingers. Snow melt straight from the ridge, carrying the taste of high stone and clean air. Blanco bent and drank, and Mesa cropped at the new grass, and they walked the meadow's edge together in the particular silence that had become, over the past months, simply the texture of being near each other. At the far end, where the cottonwood stand thinned and the view opened south, she stopped. The ranch below looked like something she had been moving toward without knowing it. The same careful, maintained intention she had seen from Foley's wagon on her first October afternoon, the mended fencing, the orderly outbuildings, the windmill turning, with the steady patience of a thing built to last. It was the same ranch. She was not the same person who had ridden toward it in October. "Waylon," she said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him. She had been thinking about this for months, arranging and rearranging the words, because she was a woman who believed in precision and had learned that imprecision in important moments costs more than the discomfort of taking the time. But standing here in the North Meadow, with the spring running cold behind her and the enormous patient sky overhead, the words she'd been arranging fell away entirely, and what came out was simply the truth. "I want you to know something," she said. "Not as a practical report, not as a situation update. I want you to know it because it's true, and because I have spent a great deal of my life not saying true things out loud, and I have decided I am done with that." He waited. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at it. "I was afraid when I got off that train," she said. "I was afraid of everything, of being wrong about you, of being wrong about this place, of wanting too much, and then losing it, of making myself small again, to fit inside something that didn't fit." She met his eyes. "I am not afraid of any of that anymore. I am standing on land that I consider mine next to a man I have chosen, and I want you to know that the choosing was real. It was not practical arrangement. It was not the absence of alternatives. I have alternatives. I am aware of them. I am here because I am here by choice, because this is where I want to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I needed to say it anyway." He reached out and took her hand, simply, directly, the way he did everything, without ceremony, meaning it entirely. "You're more than workable," he said. She laughed. She could not help it. "Waylon Hatch," she said, "you have got to stop saying that." "It's the highest thing I know how to say," he said. "Then I will take it," she said, "as the highest thing." He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. Not a grand gesture, not performed for anyone, just a quiet and precise acknowledgement of the fact of her, and then he held on, and they stood at the edge of the North Meadow and looked at the land below and the sky above, and the country spread wide in every direction, enormous and patient and entirely theirs. "What will you do with it?" she asked. "The meadow." He looked out at the grass in the spring. "Secondary fence along the east face, the rock formation, will handle half of it. Water line down from the spring to extend the usable pasture below. Grass here will hold through June if we manage the grazing rotation properly." He paused. "It doubles the north pasture capacity, maybe more." "Tomas's cousin does fence work," she said. "He's reliable. I asked Foley." He looked at her. "You already asked Foley." "I like to know what's available before the need arises," she said. He looked at the meadow, and something in his face was the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised and started being grateful, which is, she thought, the better state. "We could start in May," he said, "when the ground is right." "We could," she said. The words sat between them, ordinary and large. They rode back in the late morning. The sage was warm and fragrant in the sun, and the horses moved easy on the familiar trail, and above the Cimarron Ridge, a hawk turned slow and patient on the spring thermals, riding something invisible, entirely at home in the enormous open air. That evening, after supper, after Lily was in bed with survey stretched across her feet and her schoolwork stacked on the floor, Maren went to the kitchen and took the iron box down from the shelf. She held it in both hands for a moment. It was lighter than she remembered, or perhaps she was stronger. She had been thinking in the past weeks that both things could be true, that what she was carrying could become lighter as she learned to carry it better, and that what she became could become stronger as the carrying required it. She set the box on the table. She sat down. She looked at it. The lock no longer locked anything. She had had the key since April, 6 months ago, on the afternoon Rowan had pressed the box into her hands in the study of the Abilene house, with his face showing the particular expression of a man who has run out of time for the conversation he needed to have. She had kept the key on her person for 6 months, sewn into the hem of her riding coat alongside of the money, and she had taken it out only twice, once in November, in front of Vera Gauld, And once in December, when she had packed the last of the documents for Cisco's second Santa Fe run, she opened the lid. Inside, nothing. Empty. An echo of what had been. She had expected this. She had been the one who emptied it. And still, the sight of it produced something she had not quite anticipated. Not grief, not relief, something between the two. The feeling of a weight you have carried so long that when it is lifted, you are not simply lighter, but also uncertain of your own balance because you had organized yourself around the weight. She sat with that for a moment. Then she thought about all the things that had come from the box, not just the evidence, not just the federal case and the water rights ruling and Harlan's 18 counts. She thought about the letter Rowan had written 4 pages in his careful hand that she had read once and folded carefully and kept. "I hope it gives you freedom," he had written. She had read that sentence several times. She thought about Tate Cassidy gathering for 3 years from outside, while Rowan gathered from inside, 2 men working in parallel without knowing it, building from opposite directions toward the same truth. She thought about Vera Gault at the boarding house table in November, her careful journalist's eyes, and her 3 years of work, and her absolute commitment to finishing what Tate had started. She thought about Lily saying your hours with the serene certainty of a child who has made up her mind. She thought about all of it, and she understood that the box had not merely contained evidence. It had contained everything that came after opening it. Waylon came in from checking the horses. He saw her at the table with the open box in front of her. He came and stood beside her without speaking, which was his way, not filling space with words, but filling it with presence, which was something different and better. They looked at the empty box together. "It's just a box now," she said. "Yes," he said. "When we make this official," she said. She had not said it directly before. She said it now because she was done with imprecision in important matters. "When we file the papers and make the legal arrangement formal, I think I'd like Lily to have the option of Holt as a middle name. Lily Holt Hatch. If she wants it, when she's old enough to decide." He looked at her. "Rowan was not a good husband," she said. "But he gave me the box, and the box gave me the case, and the case gave me this, and I don't want to erase him entirely. I want to place him correctly, in the right size place, not more than he was, but not less than what he actually did." Waylon was quiet for a moment. "That seems right," he said. "I'll ask Lily." "She'll have opinions," Maren said. "She always does," he said, and something in his voice was warm with it, the warmth of a man who has learned to find a thing delightful that he once found simply challenging. She looked at the empty box on the table. She thought about placing it back on the shelf where Survey had claimed it, where it could simply be what it was now, a useful container with a history suitable for holding a cat. She thought about what it meant to carry something for 6 months across 3 states and set it down in the right place. She thought about what remained when you did. She closed the lid. She set the box back on the shelf at the far end where Survey could have his sleeping spot undisturbed. Waylon reached past her and straightened it slightly on the shelf. A small gesture. Entirely him. She turned and leaned against his chest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the kitchen shelf in the lamplight and looked at the empty box, which was no longer the center of anything. "The charges will take years to fully resolve," she said. "Yes, Harlan will appeal every finding. Probably. There will be hard days." He held her a little more firmly. "There will be," he said, "and we'll work through them." She looked at the lamp. She looked at the window facing east, which was dark now, but would show her morning in a few hours, the specific light she had come to think of as simply the beginning of the day. "We will," she said. They stood together in the quiet kitchen of a house that was warm and settled into its nighttime configuration, comfortable with itself, and outside the wind moved off the Cimarron Ridge and turned the windmill in the dark, and the stars came out over the mesa, enormous and indifferent and brilliant. The same stars she had watched from the train window in October, which had seemed then like things belonging to some other existence, and which seemed now like the sky she lived under. The lamp was lit. The house was warm. Survey shifted in the iron box on the shelf, adjusted himself, and went back to sleep with the thoroughness of a creature who has made his permanent decision about where he belongs. She was home. She had been running toward this since April when, without knowing what it was. Running from what she knew, running toward something she hadn't been permitted to name, even to herself, because naming a want makes it real, and real things can be lost, and she had spent 3 years learning what it costs to lose things you were fool enough to want. She had carried the box all the way to the Cimarron Ridge and set it down and discovered in the setting down that what she had been protecting was not only evidence. She had been protecting the possibility of this, and she had arrived. In the spring, they rode up to the North Meadow again. All three of them this time, Waylon and Maren and Lily on her small Pinto and Survey, having made another attempt on the yard and been redirected again by Tomas, whose patience with the cat appeared inexhaustible. The sage was in full bloom along the ridge trail, the air dense with it, warm and sharp and clean. The sky was that deep, unambiguous blue that has no equivalent in the flat country light she had grown up with, the blue of altitude and open space, and the specific quality of a sky that goes on without interruption until it becomes something else entirely. The meadow was greener than it had been in April. The grass had come in along the full length of the spring, new and thick, and the cottonwood stand was full-leafed, shaking silver in the late morning breeze. The water ran clear and fast, louder now, with the full snowmelt behind it. Lily ran ahead to crouch at the water's edge, her boots very close to getting wet, which was traditional, and Waylon walked to the section of the east face where the fence work had been started and stood looking at it with the particular expression of a man assessing the progress of a thing he has planned for a long time. She came and stood beside him. "The east line should be done by end of June," he said. "Tomas's cousin works fast." "He does," she said. "I checked the posts last Thursday. The footings are solid." He looked at her. "You checked the posts?" "I like to know the state of things," she said. He looked back at the fence line. Something in his expression was the thing she had been trying to find the exact word for since December, and she had finally settled on it. It was the expression of a man who has been alone for a very long time and has discovered almost accidentally that he is not alone anymore, and who has not yet finished understanding what that means but finds it entirely good. "In June," he said, "when the line is done, I want to run the north herd up here. See what the grass will hold. The spring capacities should handle 30 head through summer," she said. "Possibly more if the rains come in on schedule." "They usually do," he said. "July rains. You can set your calendar by them." She looked at the meadow. "I intend to," she said. He looked at her. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means I'm planning to be here in July to see them," she said, "and in August, and in the following October, which will be 1 year since I stepped off the train, and which I think deserves some kind of acknowledgement, though I haven't decided what kind yet." "I'll leave the acknowledgement to you," he said. "You're better at decisions of that type." "You're better at them than you think," she said. "I think you're planning to stay," he said. "I was planning to stay before the snow," she said. "I said so." "You said good." "I remember," he said. "Then why are you asking?" He looked at the meadow. "Because I like hearing you say it," he said. She looked at him. At the profile, she had learned over 7 months the specific weight of his jaw, the way the silver at his temples had extended slightly in the cold months. The small line that appeared at the corner of his eye when he was suppressing something he found either amusing or worth protecting. "I'm planning to stay," she said. "I am staying. This is where I live." He turned and looked at her, full direct with all of it visible. "Good," he said. Lily appeared at their shoulders. "If you're done," she said with the serenity of a child who has been monitoring her parents' progress with the thoroughness she applied to everything she considered important, "the horses are getting into the cottonwood." Waylon looked at his daughter. "Which horse?" he said. "Blanco," Lily said. "He's eating the low branches. You know he does that." "I know he does that," Waylon agreed. They walked back across the meadow, all three of them, and the horses and the enormous, patient sky overhead, and the spring ran clear behind them, and the sage was warm in the sun, and below, small and solid against the red earth, the ranch waited with its windmill turning and its east-facing window catching the light. She looked at it. She thought about this train platform in October, and the locked box, and the letter that was badly spelled in places, and honest in every single one. She thought about all the things the letter had not told her, and all the things she had found anyway, and how the unplanned things had turned out to be the things worth keeping. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. Then she mounted Mesa and turned him toward home, and they rode back through the spring morning with the sage in the sky and the red earth spreading out wide around them, and she was not afraid of any of it. "Waylon," she said. "Yes," he said. "We're going to be all right." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ridge and at the ranch below, and at the enormous patient country that did not know any of them and did not need to. "I think so too," he said. Above them, the sky held its ancient patient blue. The hawk that had been there in April was there again, or a different one. It did not matter which turning, slow and easy on the spring, thermals riding something invisible, going nowhere in particular, entirely at home in the open air. They rode until the ranch came up to meet them. Then they went inside.